build a thoughtful understanding of the gods based on the knowledge we have today. Violence and warfare were constant realities for people living in the pre-Christian societies of northwestern Europe. It is therefore fitting to begin an exploration of their beliefs by focusing on the gods they called upon for protection and victory in battle. During the final centuries of the pagan era, one god clearly stood out as the central figure of war: Odin. In Snorri's writings and many other poems, Odin consistently appears as the commander of armies and the giver of victory. He is associated with creatures of death like ravens and wolves, and he rules over Valhalla, the hall where brave warriors who died in battle are received. In Norse poetry from the 10th century, Odin is often depicted choosing which warriors will fall in battle so that they may join his army and fight alongside him during the final battle at the end of time. This powerful image has captivated later writers, and it is sometimes assumed that all people hoped to reach Valhalla after death. However, the surviving literature suggests otherwise. Valhalla was not seen as a universal afterlife, but rather a reward for elite warriors, kings, noblemen, and heroic leaders who had devoted themselves to Odin during their lives and sworn him loyalty in exchange for his favor. In the words attributed to the warrior Bjarki by the historian Saxo, it is Odin who is implied when he speaks of war belonging to the noble-born, and how only great men were chosen by the god of death. Odin, like a human king, gave weapons to his chosen champions, and once they accepted them, they owed him loyalty until death and beyond. Sigmund the Volsung, for example, received a magical sword placed by Odin himself into a great tree. This sword symbolized a bond between them. When Sigmund's time came, Odin appeared on the battlefield and shattered the blade with his spear. The fragments were later reforged for Sigmund's son, Sigurd, who was also favored by Odin and received a magnificent horse descended from Sleipnir. Odin gave not only gifts, but also wisdom. He taught Sigmund magical battle spells, and he advised the hero Hadding on military tactics, including the wedge formation. Odin even stood behind Hadding's troops during battle, shooting a volley of arrows with supernatural speed and clearing away storm clouds summoned by the enemy. A similar event is recorded with King Harald Wartooth of Denmark. Odin, appearing as a tall, one-eyed old man, promised him invincibility, and in return was granted all the souls slain by Harald's sword. But when Odin's favor turned, the consequences were brutal. He sparked conflict between Harald and his friend King Ring, and gave Ring the secret tactic of wedge formation. On the day of battle, Odin replaced Harald's own charioteer. When Harald begged for one final victory and promised more sacrifices, Odin flung him from the chariot and struck him down with his own sword. This harsh portrayal of Odin is not unique to Saxo, despite his Christian background. Similar themes appear elsewhere. In Hakonarmal, a 10th century poem honoring King Hakon of Norway, the king is welcomed into Odin's hall with great ceremony, but he responds with suspicion and bitterness. He accuses the gods of failing to grant him victory and declares he will keep his weapons close at hand. The poem reflects a clear sense of mistrust toward Odin. Later writings express this distrust more openly. In various sagas, characters accuse Odin of betrayal and falsehood, lamenting that he often rewards the cowardly or breaks faith with his followers. In Ketil's Saga Hengs and Hrolf's Saga Kraka, Odin is referred to as deceitful and unreliable. These recurring accusations suggest that resentment towards the god was not uncommon. This feeling of betrayal may even echo in historical records. According to Bede's ecclesiastical history, a 7th century Northumbrian priest named Coifi publicly renounced the old gods, saying that they gave no reward for faith or service. Another speaker added that in the old religion, people were left with nothing to hope for after death. Coifi, likely a priest of Odin, destroyed the temple with a spear and then set it ablaze, an act in line with the sacrificial rituals once performed in Odin's name. In Old Norse sources, several rituals are associated with the worship of Odin, particularly dedication by spear, hanging, and burning. According to Snorri's Ynglinga saga, Swedish followers of Odin believed in piercing someone with a spear at the time of death and then cremating the body. They claimed this mirrored Odin's own actions. In the poem Havamal, Odin himself says he was wounded by a spear and hanged on a tree as a sacrifice to gain wisdom. Independent records from as late as the 11th century confirm that both humans and animals were sacrificed by hanging in Sweden. Adam of Bremen, writing about the temple at Uppsala, describes a terrifying scene. During a great festival held every 9 years, the bodies of sacrificed men and animals were left hanging in the trees. His source was a 72-year-old Christian who claimed to have seen the sacrifices with his own eyes. It remains unclear whether these hangings also included a spear wound beforehand. Additionally, war captives were sometimes executed by hanging, likely as offerings to the god of war. In the 6th century, the historian Procopius wrote about the people of Thule, believed to be in Norway or Sweden, who sacrificed their first war prisoner to their god of war, whom they called Ares. This was not just a killing, but often a brutal execution, involving hanging, impalement on thorns, or other gruesome methods. A similar reference appears in Beowulf, where the Swedish king threatens to hang Geatish prisoners after the Battle of Ravenswood, turning them into a feast for scavenging birds. A vivid and disturbing tale of human sacrifice dedicated to Odin appears in the Saga of Gotrek. Though this saga is relatively late, the story feels authentic and may reflect older beliefs. It tells of King Vikar, a Viking leader who prayed to Odin for favorable winds. When lots were drawn to decide who would be sacrificed in gratitude, the lot fell on the king himself. To avoid killing him, his men decided to perform a mock ritual. Vikar stood on a tree stump with calf intestines around his neck, tied to a branch. Starkad, a warrior devoted to Odin, was to strike him lightly with a rod while reciting the dedication. However, the act turned real. The rod turned into a spear, the intestines into a strong rope, and the branch snapped upward, hanging the king and killing him. In this account, both the spear and the noose are used together. Notably, Odin bore titles such as Spear Brandisher and God of Hanged Men, reinforcing his association with such rites. Snorri also highlights the importance of cremation among Odin's followers. He wrote that anything burned with a person on the pyre was believed to travel with them to Valhalla. A dramatic combination of hanging, stabbing, and burning is described by the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who observed a Norse funeral along the Volga River in the 10th century. He saw a slave girl sacrificed at her master's funeral. She was strangled and stabbed simultaneously by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, after which her body was burned on a massive funeral pyre built on a ship. One of the onlookers remarked that a wind had risen to carry the dead man to paradise, a comment that echoes Norse beliefs described by Snorri. The words spoken by Starkad during King Vikar's death, "Now I give thee to Odin," appear in other sources as well. Such phrases could be uttered over entire enemy forces dedicated to Odin. For example, during the Battle of Fyrisvellir around the year 900, King Eric of Sweden reportedly used this ritual against Styrbjorn the Strong. While Styrbjorn prayed to Thor, Eric pledged himself to Odin, promising to die 10 years later in exchange for victory. According to the Flighty Jarbok, Odin appeared to Eric in disguise, gave him a stick, and told him to cast it over the enemy while declaring, "Odin has you all." As he did, the stick turned into a javelin mid-air and flew over Styrbjorn's troops. Suddenly, Styrbjorn and his men were struck blind, and a landslide came down from the mountain, crushing his entire army. In Eyrbyggja Saga, there is a memory of an ancient tradition where a spear is thrown over enemies before battle, believed to bring luck. Although Odin is not explicitly mentioned in this account, the gesture clearly echoes older ritual practices. In a poem describing the battle between the Goths and the Huns, likely preserving early traditions, a warrior calls upon Odin to send the spear that will determine the battle's outcome. This shows that Odin's spear, Gungnir, was not just symbolic. It was believed to initiate war itself. In the mythic account of the first war among the gods, Odin's act of hurling his spear marks the beginning of the conflict, reinforcing his role as the originator and driver of warfare. Even at the end of the pagan era, Odin remained a central figure associated with war and victory. His image as a powerful war god likely evolved from earlier beliefs held by Germanic peoples on the continent. The god Woden, or Wotan, worshipped in those regions, shared similar characteristics. The Heruli tribe, known followers of Woden, practiced rituals involving both stabbing and burning. Notably, their sacrifices did not only include war captives, but also elderly or sick individuals who were killed by stabbing just before being placed on a funeral pyre, as recorded by the historian Procopius in the 6th century. Many Germanic peoples conducted brutal sacrifices to appease their god of war. Jordanes, writing in the same century, described how the Goths revered their war god, believed to have originated among them, with blood offerings. They gave him the first share of their plunder and hung enemy weapons on trees in his honor. The intensity of these rites reflects the deep fear and reverence they held for divine powers of war and death. Even more terrifying were the practices of the Cimbri, a tribe that may have had Celtic roots, but lived closely with Germanic peoples. Strabo reports that they executed prisoners by hanging them above large bronze cauldrons. Priestesses, elderly women dressed in white, would ascend ladders to slit the throats of the hanging men, collecting the blood below. Orosius, writing in the 5th century, gives another dramatic account of the Cimbri after a great victory. They destroyed all the loot they captured, tore apart garments, threw gold and silver into rivers, smashed armor, and drowned horses. Captured enemies were hanged from trees with ropes. In this violent ritual, both the living and their possessions were sacrificed, ensuring no reward for the victors and no survival for the defeated. Tacitus also describes a similar scene in the 1st century during a battle between two Germanic tribes, the Hermundari and the Chatti. They fought over a river, valued not only for its salt deposits, but also for its spiritual significance, believed to be close to the divine. Both sides vowed to offer their enemies to Mars and Mercury if they won, a pledge that included the total destruction of the losing side: men, weapons, horses, and belongings. When the Hermundari emerged victorious, they fulfilled this horrifying vow. Roman observers, with a mixture of disdain and irony, noted the systematic slaughter as an example of barbaric devotion under the guise of religion. The scattered references to sacrificial rituals among the Germanic tribes in pre-Christian times reveal the intense fear and reverence people held for the god of war. Remarkable archaeological discoveries in Denmark's peat bogs powerfully confirm this. Sites like Thorsbjerg, Vimos, Nodam, and Kragahul have yielded organized deposits of war spoils, not randomly scattered, but seemingly arranged with purpose. These collections included weapons, armor, garments, ornaments, tools, pottery, and animal remains preserved in the peat as the objects gradually sank into the earth. At times, weapons were intentionally damaged before being deposited, highlighting their use in ritual rather than in battle. A particularly striking find in 1950 at Illerup sheds even more light on these rites. There, the equipment of around 70 warriors had been cremated, with the remaining swords and shields then deliberately bent and placed in the bog, transported on planks across the marsh. Some of these weapons were thrown into a deep pool, while others were left nearby in a spot still feared by locals. This event likely followed a single battle around the year 400, and the high value of the sacrificed items, such as swords and armor, underscores the significance of the offering. It is believed that these rituals were performed to thank or appease the god of war after victory. Although we cannot be certain what happened to the fallen warriors, there are strong hints that many met grim fates as part of these costly offerings. Ancient writings further support this view. Tacitus recounts how the Hermundari and Chatti made sacrificial vows to Mars and Mercury in hopes of winning in battle. Scholars generally agree that Mercury here represents the Germanic deity Woden, the god later known in England as Woden, honored even in the naming of Wednesday. Woden was believed to be the divine ancestor of several Anglo-Saxon royal families, much like Odin was for the Swedes. The association with Mercury, who was a guide of souls and a god of wisdom, likely reflects deeper traits in Woden's mythology that go beyond warfare alone. However, during Tacitus's time, Mars, the Roman war god, was more likely linked to another Germanic deity, Tiwaz. Odin eventually absorbed many of the roles of both Woden and Tiwaz, preserving aspects of their authority. In Snorri's writings, Tiwaz appears as Tyr, a much more obscure figure by then. Still, Tyr was known for his courage and wisdom, and warriors were said to pray to him for victory. The Norse also used Tyr's name in a more general sense to mean god, and Odin was sometimes called Sigtyr, the god of victory. Linguistic evidence connects Tiwaz with major sky gods such as the Greek Zeus and the Roman Jupiter, all sharing a root meaning god or sky. Tiwaz likely once held the role of supreme sky deity and god of battle among the early Germanic peoples. Though Odin overshadowed him by the late pagan period, traces of Tiwaz's importance remained.
Responses are usually quick, and I use my Indeed employer account to keep track of everything. And now, back to my real job.
Visit Indeed.com/hire now to sponsor a job today.
So I recently found out that you could earn cash back from dining anywhere in the US, and here's how. I'm so surprised more people aren't talking about this, because with this hack, you could earn 3% cash back when you dine out. Just open a OnePay cash account, meet the eligible deposits requirement, and select dining as your cash back category every month and pay with OnePay cash. And then you could earn 3% cash back on up to $150 spent per month on dining. And the cash back goes straight into your OnePay cash account, and it's really just that easy. You send this to your dinner date wherever you are in the US and follow for more life inspo from me to some.
In a poem about magical spells used in battle, fighters are told to carve runes of victory using Tyr's name. Weapons with possible references to the god have been found, such as a helmet from Austria bearing an inscription thought to name Tiwaz, and spears engraved with runes resembling the letter T, his initial. One such rune was discovered on a spear in an Anglo-Saxon burial ground in Kent, perhaps carved for protection in battle. Despite the harshness of the rites linked to Tiwaz, he does not seem to have been a simple god of violence. In Roman-era inscriptions, he appears with the title Mars Thingsus, suggesting a connection to the Thing, the tribal assembly where laws were made and disputes resolved. This points to a dual role. He was both the bringer of military victory and the upholder of legal order. Tacitus notes that punishment among the Germans was only carried out by priests acting under the authority of the battle god. This implies that the deity responsible for war was also entrusted with maintaining justice and community discipline. The belief in the sword duel as a legitimate means of resolving disputes endured in the north for a long time. In Iceland, the holmgang, or formal duel, took place near the site of the nation's principal assembly, where major legal matters were decided. This suggests that settling issues by combat was viewed as an extension of law and justice. Among the Germanic tribes, the sword had long served as a final judge. Tacitus tells us they used duels not only to settle conflicts, but also as a form of divination before battles. They would capture an enemy and make him fight one of their own warriors, believing the outcome revealed their chances of victory in the larger battle. Early records contain many accounts of duels between champions as both armies looked on, waiting to see who would prevail. Paul the Deacon, writing in the 8th century, captured the spirit of this practice, proposing that a single combat between two leaders could spare the bloodshed of thousands. It was common among the Germanic peoples to swear oaths on their weapons, a custom dating back to their pagan past. This practice reflected their belief that the god of war was the ultimate judge. A warrior's life depended on his weapons, so breaking an oath sworn on a sword or spear was considered dangerous. It was feared that such a betrayal would cause the weapon to fail when most needed. There were even curses that threatened a man with the terrifying fate of being struck down by his own blade, should he break his word. The one surviving myth about Tyr in Snorri's work tells of his role in binding the monstrous wolf Fenrir, a sworn enemy of the gods. Only Tyr had the courage to approach and feed the beast, and he ultimately sacrificed his hand to ensure the wolf could be restrained. At Ragnarok, Fenrir would face Odin, but it's likely that in older myths, this confrontation originally involved Tiwaz, the ancient battle god. Snorri also mentions that Tyr meets his end at the jaws of a hound named Garm, who may be another name for Fenrir. Tacitus writes about the Semnones, a fierce tribe that later became known as the Alemanni, living between the Rhine and the Oder. They worshipped a deity called the God and ruler of all. Around 92 AD, their king visited Rome, and Tacitus may have learned of their customs through him. Each year, the Semnones gathered with related tribes in a sacred grove where they performed human sacrifices. All who entered the grove had to be bound with a cord, showing submission to the god, and if someone fell, they had to crawl rather than stand. This ritual reflected the god's power to bind his followers, much like Tyr bound Fenrir. Odin, too, would later be associated with this idea of binding in his role as a war god. While it is uncertain, Tiwaz was likely the god worshipped by the Semnones in this sacred grove. Another figure, Saxnot, worshipped by the Saxons, may also have been a version of Tiwaz. In early Christian texts, Saxnot is listed alongside Woden and Thunor as a deity who had to be renounced at baptism. This shows his prominence. Sax-Not, whose name may have originally meant sword companion, could have been a god to whom swords were dedicated or offered in sacrifice. The Saxons may have brought his worship to Britain during their migrations. In England, Tiwaz was known as Tew or Tig, names that appear in old place names like Tewin in Hertfordshire and Tuesley in Surrey. At Tysoe near Banbury, a red horse was carved into a hillside and maintained every Palm Sunday up until the late 18th century. This may indicate that the area was once sacred to the god and that the horse was somehow connected to his worship. Tiwaz was an early Germanic war god and is thought to be an ancestor to Odin. He held great power, and people made significant sacrifices in his honor. Tiwaz was known as the one-handed god, a trait that may date back to prehistoric times, as suggested by ancient Scandinavian rock carvings showing one-handed warriors. This has led scholars like Dumazil to connect his story with that of the Roman hero Mucius Scaevola, who sacrificed his hand for the good of his people. Unlike Odin, who later replaced him as the god of battle, Tiwaz was linked to justice and legal order. Odin, though famed for wisdom and cleverness, was often portrayed as unreliable and deceitful. To understand how the god of war's character evolved, we must look closely at Odin's world, especially his relationship with the dead and those who served him. In Snorri's descriptions of the afterlife, Odin is linked to warrior spirits and to the Valkyries, female figures who connect the living and the dead. Valkyries serve the fallen warriors in Valhalla and carry out Odin's will during battles. They appear as armored horsewomen who move swiftly across the sky and earth, choosing which warriors would die and guiding them to the afterlife. Sometimes they are even described as human women, such as princesses or the wives of heroes, who became Valkyries, possibly indicating a link to ancient priestess roles. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Valkyrie names like Hildur and Hlok were common in poetry, and many of them simply meant battle. These poems reveal a deep literary tradition that blended various ideas. Valkyries resembled the Norns, who shaped fate, and shared features with seeresses who cast protective spells. Some also reflect guardian spirits of families, or even warrior women known from the Black Sea region. There may also be echoes of real priestesses who conducted battlefield sacrifices. Since the Valkyrie name literally means chooser of the slain, it's clear they were believed to determine who would die in the battle. An Anglo-Saxon bishop named Wulfstan even included choosers of the slain in a list of sinners and witches, suggesting that the belief in their existence lingered long after paganism had faded. A dramatic echo of these beliefs appears in a 10th century Volga ship burial, where an elderly woman organized the ritual killing of a slave girl. She was called the Angel of Death and had 2 assistants described as her daughters. Her grim role and the secrecy around such rituals likely inspired dark legends, especially since sacrificial victims were often chosen by drawing lots. The notion that the god selected the slain through these women likely became widely accepted, reinforcing the idea of divine will in death. From early times, Germanic people seemed to believe in fierce female spirits who carried out the war god's commands, bringing chaos and taking the lives of the fallen. Wulfstan's use of the term Welserian, chooser of the slain, is significant, and earlier Old English sources used the same term to translate the names of the Greek Furies, such as Erinus and Tisiphone. Even earlier evidence comes from northern England. At Housesteads, on Hadrian's Wall, 2 votive stones were discovered, one of which was dedicated to Mars Thinxus, and 2 goddesses named Beda and Fimoline. Another altar, found in 1926, was also dedicated to the Alaisiagai, goddesses whose names translate as ruler of battle and giver of freedom. These would be fitting names for Valkyries, reinforcing the idea of a group of divine women associated with warfare. This belief in female battle spirits also appears in magical charms from the Christian period. One is the Merseburg charm from southern Germany.
Introducing our biggest GMC Acadia ever. Offering bigger screens and bigger tech, like available Super Cruise hands-free driving. Live your biggest life in the new GMC Acadia.
Get 2.9% APR on 2026 Acadia models. Plus, get $750 purchase allowance when you finance through GM Financial. We are professional grade.
Long story short, the world's in trouble.
So what are we waiting for? Let's give Sephiroth the beating of a lifetime.
The sky's the limit!
Let us put your faith to the test, Cloud. At last, the promise is fulfilled. The journey ends here.
Germany, which tells of the Idacy, female figures who sat together, some tying bonds, and others freeing captives. The spell ends by urging the victim to break free from his bonds and escape. A similar idea is found in an Old English charm, Against Pain. While it begins humbly, it suddenly turns vivid and heroic, describing loud women riding across the land and shooting spears. These mighty women are clearly envisioned as supernatural warriors, and the pain is imagined as an attack by their weapons. Later in the charm, weapons from the gods are also mentioned, suggesting that the original purpose of this spell was for battle, though it was later repurposed for common ailments. Another Old English charm refers to a swarm of bees as victory women, which may also be a faint memory of these ancient battle spirits. These traces show that the idea of powerful supernatural women tied to war and fate remained deeply embedded in Germanic culture, surviving long after the rise of Christianity. Odin was often connected to powers like breaking or casting magical bindings, throwing spears, and flying through the air. In the poem Havamal, he recites a spell to place bonds on his enemies, likely magical restraints affecting the mind rather than physical ones. The Ynglinga saga also describes how Odin could make his enemies blind, deaf, or filled with terror in battle, causing their weapons to become useless. A powerful example of this kind of spell can be found in Hardar Saga, where the hero Hord, though a fearless and capable fighter, is suddenly struck by what's called a war fetter. This wasn't simple fear, but a magical paralysis, like the helplessness one feels in a nightmare. Though Hord managed to break free from it 3 times, the 4th time it left him vulnerable to being surrounded and ultimately killed. Interestingly, one of the Valkyrie names is Herfjotr, war fetter, which connects them to this same magical binding. A related name among the goddesses, Alaisiagai, Friagabi, meaning giver of freedom, may also be linked to this idea. While Old Norse texts often present Valkyries as noble warrior women on horseback, another more gruesome tradition survives as well. In some stories, enormous female figures are shown pouring blood over the land where battles are about to occur. They carry troughs of blood, ride wolves, or appear rowing boats through blood-filled skies. These beings usually signal an approaching battle and death, sometimes appearing in dreams, and they were described by poets in the 10th and 11th centuries. One of the most memorable versions of this vision appears in Njal's saga, before the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. A group of women are seen weaving a terrifying tapestry made from human entrails and skulls. They speak a poem known as the Daradar Jod, or Spear Lay, claiming the power to decide who will live and die in the battle. They describe a sky turned red with blood and chant their deadly songs as they determine the fates of warriors. Although the poem might originally refer to a different Irish battle, its theme clearly aligns with other stories of fearsome women controlling life and death through war. Similar supernatural female figures also appear in Irish mythology. In Celtic tales, the goddesses Morrigu and Bobd often show up before or during battles, sometimes in the form of birds of prey, foretelling death and chaos. These battlefield women echo the role of Valkyries and are closely tied to ravens and wolves, animals that commonly appear in battle scenes and are associated with Odin in both Norse and Old English poetry. For instance, in the Old English poem Exodus, the raven is called Chooser of the Slain, and in the Norse poem Hrafnsmal, a Valkyrie speaks with a raven. Both animals are seen circling battlefields, feeding on the dead, and are symbolic of war and divine judgment. These similarities between Germanic and Celtic traditions suggest that the idea of warrior spirits tied to the god of battle was widespread, particularly during times when these cultures were in contact during the Roman era. Over time, Norse poets refined the image of the Valkyrie, making her appear more noble and composed. Yet beneath this poetic gloss, the older image of the terrifying Chooser of the Slain, blood-soaked and merciless, continues to survive, hinting at the darker origins of these powerful figures. Odin's influence over warriors during battle extended beyond simply weakening their resolve or confusing their minds. He also had the power to fill them with an overwhelming battle frenzy. This intense state is best seen in the phenomenon of the berserks, warriors who, overtaken by a wild and ecstatic rage, became immune to pain and fear. According to Snorri, these men fought without armor, bit their shields, and attacked like wild animals, completely untouched by fire or steel. This condition was known as going berserk. In later saga traditions, berserks were often depicted as monstrous opponents defeated by heroic figures. Yet their core traits remained important. They entered battle in a trance-like fury and were seen as a unique warrior class, existing outside the bounds of normal society. Such warriors were known long before the Viking era. Among the Chatti, a Germanic tribe described by Tacitus in the 1st century, fighters wore iron collars they could only remove after killing an enemy. Some chose to wear them for life, continuing to fight until age wore them down. These men lived apart from society and always led the charge into battle, living off the generosity or fear of others. Tacitus also wrote about the Herri, another warrior group known for psychological warfare. They painted their shields and bodies black and launched surprise attacks at night, using fear to unsettle their enemies. Their terrifying appearance was a key part of their strategy. Similarly, the Heruli, who followed the war god and practiced cremation rituals, deliberately avoided armor, wearing only cloaks and shields as they entered battle. In the time of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first king, berserks served in his personal guard. They were referred to as wolf coats and held positions of honor on the king's ship. According to some interpretations, being struck by a spear, symbolic of Odin, was an initiation rite marking them as dedicated to the god, promising them eternal life in his service. Berserks were seen as sacred, necessary figures who balanced the structured world with wild chaos. Berserks were often said to transform into animals during their rage. One example is Bödvar Bjarki, who supposedly fought as a bear while his physical body lay sleeping. This legend may reflect the
This message is brought to you by lobbyists with special interests.
Beyond wants you to believe that plants are good to eat, but their plant-based meat is made from plants that are grown in dirt, and that's just dirty. Beyond wants to contaminate your body with protein from mystery ingredients like peas, lentils, faba beans, and oil from green rocks. It's sourced by dangerous American farmers who want to harm you and your family and control your mind. They use the same protein you put in your workout smoothie. And we're like, okay. It's made on the same kind of machines that process pasta. And we all know who eats pasta.
Forget about it.
Protect yourself from the evil plant agenda and stop Beyond at the root.
I believe everything I'm told, and I approve this message.
Now that Coursera Plus is 40% off, it's time to go after your goals. With over 10,000 programs from IBM, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and more, you can gain momentum for the rest of your year and beyond. Save 40% on Coursera Plus and make big progress.
Berserk's animalistic fury. In daily life, such uncontrollable rage could be dangerous. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson describes how his father, once a berserk, was overtaken by rage during a ball game and accidentally killed a nurse, nearly harming his own son as well. Some tales say berserks were cured of their rage after converting to Christianity. Their association with animals may have been reinforced by their wearing of animal skins, a tradition mirrored by secret warrior societies in other cultures, like the leopard men of Africa. Evidence of warrior initiation rituals survives in saga literature. In Hrolf's Saga Kraka, a youth had to slay a monster effigy and drink its blood. In Volsunga's saga, Sigmund and his son wore wolf skins, which they couldn't remove, and spoke in the language of wolves. They made a pact to fight fairly and aid each other when outnumbered, showing the disciplined code of these warrior groups. Later in the Viking Age, organized warrior societies continued to exist. The most famous was the Brotherhood of Jomsborg, a community of bachelors who lived by strict rules. No one older than 50 or younger than 18 could join. They weren't allowed to quarrel or express fear. They couldn't retreat from battle or keep women in the stronghold. Archaeological finds at places like Trelleborg and Agersborg support the existence of such camps. These fortresses, resembling Roman military layouts, housed disciplined fighters likely used by kings like Svein of Denmark during invasions. These communities probably represent the final form of a long-standing tradition of elite warrior bands, made up mostly of unmarried youths and a few seasoned veterans. They formed the core of royal guards in Scandinavia and likely influenced the enduring image of Odin and his chosen fighters. Their presence in memory and story, especially in texts like Saxo's Gesta Danorum, explains the persistent fascination with Odin's warrior cult and its vital role in northern literature. The war god held significant power in northern Europe from a very early time. In ancient Germanic belief, Tiwaz was honored as the chief of armies and a guardian of justice. However, as time passed, Woden began to rise in importance. By the 1st century, tribes such as the Hermunduri and Chatti were performing sacrifices to both Tiwaz and Woden, suggesting a shift in religious focus. Woden, who was associated with death and seen as the ancestor of German kings, may have already been challenging Tiwaz's dominance in war. In the later pagan period, Woden had become a symbol of battle. He carried a spear, was linked to wolves and ravens, and was seen as the one who could choose who lived or died in battle. In Sweden, he was known as Odin, the supreme god with power to both release and restrain. His servants, the Valkyries, were feared as agents of death. Odin's name is thought to mean the one who causes madness, fitting his chaotic and fearsome nature. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described Odin simply as fury. Odin was also connected to death and magic, known for putting his warriors into a trance-like battle frenzy. This madness, experienced by the berserks, made them fearless and seemingly immune to pain. In Odin's hall, Valhalla, warriors spent their days fighting and drinking, losing themselves in the very activities that brought them closer to the god spirit. For the Germanic and Viking peoples, battle was a deeply personal act. Accounts from both classical sources and native sagas emphasize individual combat and close-range fighting. In such an environment, belief in Odin, who granted courage, frenzy, and the will to fight, was a valuable advantage. His followers believed that this divine madness could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But Odin's gifts were double-edged. Berserks, despite their ferocity, were not guaranteed to win. They could still be killed in battle or survive only to suffer permanent injury. Deeds vowed during drunken feasts could become burdens once sobriety returned, as seen repeatedly in heroic tales. Because of this, Odin was also remembered as the great deceiver, a god who inspired, but could just as easily betray. Throughout the pagan era, the need for a war god was constant. The history of the Germanic tribes and Vikings was filled with conflict. Internal rivalries, invasions, and battles shaped their world. Their heroic stories arose from a society defined by violence and short lifespans. Disputes were often resolved by force, and the ideal leader was a brave warrior with a small, loyal band of fighters. These men often lived on the edge, gaining land, families, and wealth through combat, and always at risk of losing everything. Loyalty was secured through gifts of weapons and armor, won in war and shared by the leader. It is no wonder that people in such a world placed their trust in the war god. They prayed for protection in combat and for the uncertain promise of victory, a goal that rested more on spirit and chance than on sheer strength. In early Germanic religion, the bloody sacrifices of prisoners and criminals revealed a belief that the god of war demanded blood. If not satisfied, he would take the lives of his own worshippers. Brutal sacrifices performed by priestesses foreshadowed the later image of bloodthirsty Valkyries who stirred up war and rejoiced in slaughter. To honor the war god, not only blood was spilled, but also weapons and armor were offered, thrown into lakes, buried in bogs, or burned in ceremonial fires. Over time, the image of the war god seems to have shifted. In earlier periods, he was seen as a supreme ruler who held victory or defeat in his hands and taught men the importance of law and order among themselves. Later, however, he came to be viewed more as a capricious power, one who granted madness to his followers and handed out victory or defeat with the arrogance of a mortal tyrant. It's possible that this contrast is exaggerated by the fragmented evidence we possess, and that Tiwaz too may have had a willful, unpredictable nature. The madness associated with Woden and Odin, whom we know far more about, was believed to bring dazzling gifts, but it also demanded terrible costs. Odin does not appear to be a god whom people could truly love or respect. Rather, he was feared, and at times men even took pride in his intoxicating power. Still, the image of Odin solely as a war god is incomplete. To fully understand him, we must also consider his role as a god of the dead. In the myths preserved by Snorri, Thor stands out as one of the most vividly portrayed gods. He is the mighty protector of Asgard and the champion of the Aesir, depicted as a powerful red-bearded figure armed with a magical hammer, iron gloves, and a belt that doubles his strength. Thor's worship endured for centuries across Western Europe, and even in the 11th century, Viking communities in Dublin continued to revere him. As the pagan era drew to a close, Thor came to symbolize direct opposition to Christ, seen in legends like a tug-of-war between Thor and King Olaf Tryggvason, or in a woman's claim that Thor challenged Christ to a duel. Thor embodied the Viking ideal of strength, bravery, and straightforward action. He was loud, bold, and untamed, a perfect reflection of the Viking spirit. Much like the Indian god Indra, Thor was known for his tremendous appetite and physical power. When disguised as Freya at the Hall of Thrym, he famously consumed an ox, 8 salmon, and 3 large cups of mead. On another occasion, he devoured 2 of the 3 oxen served by the giant Hymir during their fishing trip. In the Hall of Utgard Loki, Thor attempted to drain an immense drinking horn whose end reached the sea itself. Although he was tricked, his effort was so immense that it lowered the ocean's level. Many of Thor's adventures, such as wearing a bridal dress or suffering embarrassment at the hands of cunning giants, were likely meant for comic storytelling, especially during a time when belief in him was fading. But even these humorous tales reflect something important about his personality. Thor's love of food, drink, and physical confrontation matched his image as a god of brute strength and unstoppable vitality. He relied not on deceit or trickery like Odin or Loki, but on direct force, smashing his enemies with his hammer or hurling it from afar to crush them. Thor's power over stone and fire is another recurring theme. He killed his enemy Geirrod by flinging a red-hot object through a pillar, and once used a drinking horn as a weapon, launching it through stone and shattering it against Hymir's skull. He defeated giantesses with rocks or sheer weight, always through overwhelming strength. One saga claims that while Odin granted victory in battle, it was Thor who broke rocks and shattered cliffs, showing him as a destructive force of nature, an earthshaker, a tree feller, a storm bringer. Thor's world was very different from Odin's. His worship was not elite or aristocratic. In fact, he was sometimes mocked for receiving the souls of thralls, while Odin claimed the fallen kings. But Thor's influence stretched far and wide, touching not just the skies, but all aspects of everyday life. If Odin inherited some of the traits of the ancient sky god Tiwaz, a large portion of that divine legacy also fell on the broad shoulders of Thor. He was not just the god of thunder, he was the god of the people. By the end of the pagan era, statues of Thor holding his hammer were reported to stand in many temples. More is known about Thor's images than those of any other Norse deity. And when he shared a temple with other gods, he was usually given the place of highest honor. These images were richly adorned, and offerings of food such as meat and bread were made to him in Norwegian temples. Worshippers would seek guidance from Thor's image when faced with difficult choices. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, confirms saga accounts by describing Thor's statue in the temple at Uppsala, holding a scepter, likely his hammer. A medieval Irish poem refers to a black devil and a golden castle, interpreted as a reference to a dark image of Thor in his Dublin shrine. In fact, in 994, King Maelsechlin is said to have seized Thor's ring and other treasures from that shrine. Norse sources like Heimskringla and Flateyjarbók describe how Christian kings of Norway destroyed large statues of Thor. indicating that these idols were life-sized or larger. A depiction of one such statue in Trondheim includes a chariot drawn by 2 goats, in which Thor sat magnificently decorated in gold and silver. The goats and chariot were intricately crafted, with silver-twisted ropes attached to their horns. When King Olaf Tryggvason was brought to see the statue, he was persuaded to pull the rope, causing the goats to move. This act was interpreted as service to Thor, which enraged the king and led him to command the destruction of the idols himself. The moving chariot likely formed part of a ritual honoring the god. The thunderous sound of Thor's chariot was believed to be the origin of thunder itself. Snorri traces Thor's name from the verb to drive, portraying him as the charioteer god who races across the sky. This imagery is consistent with depictions of sun gods in other traditions, and the association between thunder and wheeled movement seems to have deep roots in Northern Europe. Some Lapland words for thunder appear to come from an Old Norse term that meant both thunder and a wheeled vehicle. Skaldic verse from the 9th century also emphasizes Thor's arrival with crashing storms. One poem, Haustlung, describes Thor's journey to confront the giant Hrungnir. The earth shakes, stones break, and the sky seems to burn as the goats pull Thor's wagon through the heavens. Thor's presence in temples wasn't just symbolic of thunder. Many sources speak of a sacred gold or silver ring used for oath-taking, often kept in temples where Thor was worshipped. This ring was tied to Thor's name beyond the Norse lands. In Irish accounts, the Ring of Thor is among the treasures seized from his temple in 994. Earlier still, in 876, Danish leaders in England are said to have sworn a truce with King Alfred on such a sacred ring. Descriptions indicate this was more of an arm ring than a finger ring. One saga tells of a priest wearing it on his arm for protection, and other accounts suggest it weighed as much as 20 ounces of silver, far heavier than a typical ring. The oath formula mentioned in several sagas includes Freyr, Njord, and the Almighty God, often assumed to be Thor, due to his link with the oath ring. Iceland's National Assembly even opened on Thor's Day, and Adam of Bremen mentions the destruction of Thor's image in Uppsala's assembly site around the year 1030. It appears that Thor inherited many roles once held by the older sky god Tiwaz, especially the power to sanctify oaths and bind agreements. One of Thor's most devoted followers mentioned in the sagas is Thorolf Mostrarskegg, known as the Bearded Man of Most. His story is detailed in Eyrbyggja Saga and the Book of Settlements. Originally from the small island of Most off Norway's western coast, Thorolf sought Thor's guidance when King Harald Fairhair's rule became oppressive. Receiving what he believed to be a favorable response, he dismantled Thor's shrine, loaded its carved high-seat pillars, most of its timber, and even the soil beneath Thor's pedestal onto his ship. Upon reaching Iceland, he cast the high-seat pillars into the sea, then chose to settle at the spot where they washed ashore. There, he outlined his land using fire and began constructing both his home and a grand new temple dedicated to Thor. This temple included carved pillars with sacred nails, a holy oath ring, a sacrificial bowl for catching blood, and statues of Thor and other gods. The emphasis on high-seat pillars is notable. In Scandinavian tradition, these were the ornate wooden posts that flanked the seat of honor in a hall. Their inclusion in Thor's temple suggests a symbolic transfer of authority and divine presence. Thor's link to the skies and storms also made him a powerful figure for those embarking on sea voyages. Worshippers prayed to him for good winds and safe passage, and many settlers in Iceland adopted Thorolf's method, casting high-seat pillars into the water and settling where they came ashore, trusting Thor to guide them. Some accounts even mention images of Thor being carved directly onto these pillars, reinforcing his protective role. The reference to god nails driven into the temple pillars may reflect a deeper ritual function. A clue to their purpose comes from 17th century descriptions of Lapp religious customs. The Lapps worshipped a thunder god represented as a rough wooden figure with a carved head and stick arms, one of which held a mallet. Into the head of the figure, they drove an iron nail and embedded a piece of flint, possibly to symbolically spark fire. If similar nails in Thor's temple pillars were used to create ritual fire, it may explain an unusual myth involving Thor's battle with the giant Hrungnir. In that tale, Thor throws his hammer while the giant hurls a whetstone. The hammer shatters the stone, but a fragment remains lodged in Thor's head. Such an image could be rooted in poetic symbolism or ceremonial tradition. Georges Dumézil suggested that the myth, which includes two duels between the gods and their helpers, may echo an ancient initiation rite, where a young warrior symbolically defeats a mock enemy. The embedded whetstone might represent the spark of fire created by striking stone against metal, an action that mirrors lightning in nature. This idea is strengthened by later references in Icelandic sagas to fire in Thor's temples. In Kjalnesinga saga, the temple is described in traditional terms, but with an iron-topped altar that held a fire which was never allowed to die out. This sacred flame likely symbolized Thor's elemental power and divine presence. Many have dismissed the idea of Thor's connection with fire as a literary invention, possibly inspired by classical sources. Yet there is growing reason to believe that this link was genuinely rooted in older traditions. Thorolf's ritual of claiming land with fire in Thor's name supports the association, as does the possibility that cremation rites were tied to Thor alongside Odin. Among the old Prussians, a sacred fire burned continuously in a sanctuary dedicated to the thunder god, built within an oak grove. Thor's dominion over lightning, heavenly fire, further reinforces this connection, and it seems that thunder itself was symbolically recreated in rituals conducted within his temples. Thor's hammer was central to his mythos and religious symbolism. It was not just a weapon. It represented divine power, protection, and sanctity. The myths often describe Mjolnir as the most valuable treasure of the gods, essential for defending Asgard from the giants. It was used in marriage rites to bless the bride, as seen in the myth where Thor disguises himself as a bride to retrieve the stolen hammer. The hammer's role in hallowing weddings may stem from ancient practices, possibly even reflected in Bronze Age rock carvings that show large figures raising a hammer-like object over two smaller ones, perhaps a representation of a wedding ritual. Mjolnir also had important roles in birth and death. The hammer was raised to bless a newborn being accepted into the community, and it was brought forth during funerals to sanctify the dead. At Baldur's death, Thor's hammer was used to consecrate the funeral ship before it was burned. Thor even used the hammer to revive his goats after eating them, simply by making a gesture over their bones and skins. This act of restoration hints at the hammer's deeper spiritual power, connected to renewal and resurrection. Much like the Christian cross, the hammer became a sacred symbol of protection and blessing. The saga of King Hakon the Good tells how he tried to protect himself at pagan sacrifices by making the sign of the cross. When questioned, a companion claimed that Hakon had actually made the sign of the hammer instead, aligning himself with Thor. In the 10th century, people often wore small hammer-shaped pendants on necklaces, some of which have been found in Viking silver hoards in Scandinavia. These amulets bear a striking resemblance to the small Christian crosses of the same era. Some even suggest that Thor's symbol became popular as a cultural reaction to the spread of Christianity. A mold from Copenhagen, used to cast both hammers and crosses, demonstrates how silversmiths catered to both faiths. Earlier examples of hammer amulets have also been found in Anglo-Saxon graves in Kent, possibly indicating a much older tradition. One particularly striking use of the hammer is recorded by the medieval historian Saxo Grammaticus. He wrote that massive ritual hammers were kept in a Swedish temple to Thor and were taken away in 1125 by Magnus Nilsson. These heavy bronze hammers, which the locals referred to as belonging to Jupiter, were believed to mimic the sound of thunder. According to Saxo, the ancient worshippers associated the crash of thunder with the clang of a smith's hammer, forging a direct link between the divine and the act of metalworking. Magnus removed the hammers as part of his effort to eradicate pagan practices, but the Swedes continued to view his actions as sacrilege, accusing him of robbing the temple of its sacred symbols. The shape of Thor's hammer resembles the ancient double-headed axe, another object tied to thunder gods in many early cultures. This symbolic weapon appeared in temples throughout the ancient world and was also associated with divine storms. Thor's Germanic forerunner, Donar, was often equated with Hercules, a powerful hero armed with a club who fought monsters. This association likely arose from the shared imagery of the weapon. Both the hammer and the club stood for raw strength and divine wrath. Roman soldiers stationed in the western provinces erected inscriptions to Hercules, showing how the blending of Roman and Germanic beliefs supported the identification of Thor with the great strongman of myth. Tacitus even recorded that Germanic tribes sang songs of Hercules before battle, believing he had once walked among them. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, could be thrown like a weapon, and one of its most well-known traits was its ability to return to his hand after being hurled. This made it an ideal symbol of the thunderbolt cast down by a wrathful god. Both Snorri and Saxo mention that the hammer had a short handle. Snorri explains this through a tale where Loki interfered during its forging, while Saxo attributes it to a battle where Hotherus broke the shaft. The short-handled design is also seen in Danish amulets, many of which have a metal ring through the handle. Such a ring may have been intended to help throw the hammer more effectively, much like the hammers used in traditional Highland games. On a rune stone from Stenkvista in Sweden, a hammer with a looped handle appears as a protective sign on a grave, representing Thor's blessing. Objects that resemble hammers or double axes appear among magical symbols used by Lappish shamans on their ceremonial drums, which were used before Christianity arrived. These drums were struck with tools that looked like small hammers, creating a clear connection to the thunderous metal hammers reportedly used in Thor's temples. The Lappish thunder god, known as Horagales, is believed to have a name derived from Old Man Thor. On some drums, a male figure is shown holding two hammer-like objects, or sometimes a cross with hooked ends, similar to a swastika. This ancient symbol has been found across many cultures and is thought to have connections to fire or to the sun wheel of the Bronze Age. It may have evolved from the hammer or axe symbols associated with thunder and lightning, linking it to Thor as the bringer of both sunlight and storm. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, The thunder god was called Thunor. Though Christianity eventually replaced the old gods, echoes of Thunor remain, such as in a 10th century charter where the Christian god is referred to as the High Thunderer. The swastika symbol appears frequently in Anglo-Saxon graves from the pagan era, especially on cremation urns in East Anglia. These symbols, often carved with precision and care, likely held special importance in funerary contexts. In both Norway and Sweden, stones bearing early runic inscriptions also display swastikas and hammer symbols, frequently invoking Thor's protection over graves and monuments. Swastikas are also found on weapons, such as sword hilts and scabbards, including examples from Danish bogs dating back to the 3rd century, and Anglo-Saxon graves like Bifrons in Kent. By the 7th century, Christian crosses began to appear alongside them, as in a decorative sword from the River Seine that shows both the swastika and the cross side by side. Thor's hammer was far more than a destructive weapon. It embodied the god's power over every aspect of communal life. It played a role in life's major milestones: births, weddings, funerals, and oath-making. It was tied to land settlement, travel, warfare, and feasting. Mjolnir symbolized the storm's fury and the fire of lightning, but it was also a guardian against evil and chaos. It was the force that kept Asgard safe from the giants, and mortals, too, trusted in it for protection, stability, and the preservation of justice. Thor was often described in early Norse poetry as the son of Earth, and many traditions identified the Earth itself as his mother. His wife, Sif, remains a mysterious figure, but she is famously known for her golden hair. Some have interpreted her radiant locks as a symbol of fertility, possibly linked to ancient agricultural beliefs, where her hair represents golden fields of grain. This fits well with Thor's role as the god of thunder and rain, whose power was essential for the growth and fertility of the land. Adam of Bremen noted that Thor held sway over the air, controlling storms, good weather, and the yield of the earth, making him the most revered of the gods. When early settlers traveled from Norway to Iceland, many of them brought not only the wooden pillars from Thor's temple, but also soil from beneath them. This earth was likely considered sacred, and upon settling, the new land would be consecrated in Thor's name before any construction or farming began. Thor was thus deeply associated with nature's forces, both destructive and nurturing. He was the protector of travelers, and especially important to those venturing across the sea. Even after converting to Christianity, figures like Helgi the Lean were said to still call on Thor for safe passage during sea journeys. Thor was believed to stir the weather with divine power. In one tale, his follower Raud urged him to blow into his beard, causing a fierce storm to rise against King Olaf Tryggvason. Thor's association with red hair and storms appears repeatedly in Norse stories. His red beard may have symbolized lightning, or perhaps the red skies that precede a storm. In Floamanna Saga, Thor appears in a dream to a Christian convert, warning him of deadly seas unless he returns to worship the god. He shows the man violent waves crashing on rocks, foretelling his doom. Christian missionaries like Thangbrand were also said to suffer Thor's wrath, their ships smashed by storms he summoned. Yet Thor's power wasn't only destructive, he could be generous to his followers. When Thorhall, one of the Norse explorers of Vinland, prayed to him, Thor answered by driving a whale ashore for food. Thorhall then mocked the Christians, claiming that his poetry in honor of Thor had succeeded where their god had failed. The symbolic power of Thor's red beard is often emphasized, possibly linking it to fire, lightning, or the stormy sky. The poetry also describes his terrifying appearance, his burning eyes and thunderous voice striking fear into those who saw or heard him. While Norse mythology often likened Thor to Hercules, with his hammer and strength, other traditions associated him with Jupiter, the Roman sky god. Thor's hammer, much like Jupiter's thunderbolt, signified divine authority and power over the elements. Thursday, known in Latin as Dies Iovis, Jupiter's Day, became Thor's Day among Germanic peoples. In English, it became Thursday, and in German, Donnerstag. The day held sacred meaning, so much so that Christian leaders like Bishop Eligius in the 7th century had to caution their followers for continuing to observe it as a holy day, long after the official rise of Christianity. Thor's presence remained strong in cultural memory, tied to the rhythms of nature, the cycles of the week, and the fierce power of the storm. There is strong reason to believe that the worship of Thor remained powerful and widespread in the north up until the end of the pagan era. Two pieces of evidence highlight how deeply rooted his cult was: the large number of children named after him in Scandinavia, and the many places that bore his name. Even the Irish in Dublin referred to Viking settlers as the people of Thor. His followers, often proud and self-reliant individuals, like the Norwegian farmers, Icelandic and Irish settlers, or roving adventurers, tended to be those who preferred to make their own decisions rather than submit to centralized authority. Thor's cult, in essence,
I love you too, Mom.
Incorrect password.
Technology, am I right?
We need a new tech lead.
Sponsor your job on Indeed and get matched with quality candidates when you need them most. Visit Indeed.com/hire now.
appealed to those who trusted in personal strength and independence. As the sky god, Thor was called upon to bless and protect nearly every part of communal life. However, when we compare this serious role to the mythical stories surrounding him, where he often charges off to kill trolls or smashes unwanted giants in Asgard, there seems to be a disconnect. These myths frequently portray him with humor, emphasizing his brute force and unpredictable temper, and often boil down his actions to a single, familiar solution: using his hammer. It's worth remembering, though, that myths are often reshaped over time, sometimes simplified, sometimes made humorous, especially in retellings like those by Snorri, which were recorded long after the end of paganism. Still, the enemies Thor faces in these tales tell us much about his character and significance. Thor's main foes are the frost giants and giantesses, figures like Hrungnir, Thrym, Hymir, and Geirrod, representatives of chaos and destruction. Occasionally, they try to trick or ambush him, but usually he sets out to face them directly and defeats them with ease once battle begins. Yet his most dangerous opponent is the world serpent, a monstrous creature that encircles the earth. One humorous tale tells of Thor trying to lift the serpent disguised as a giant cat. But a more serious version exists in the myth of Thor's fishing trip with the giant Hymir, where he hooks the serpent from the ocean depths. This tale appears to have carried real weight in early poetic tradition. 4 poems written before the year 1000 describe the scene in detail, including Ragnarsdrapa, Husdrapa, and works by Gamli Gnevadarsskald and Eystein Valdason. These all predate the more familiar Eddic poem Hymiskvida, which recounts the event with a more playful tone. The poem Husdrapa claims to describe carved panels in an Icelandic hall, one of which shows Thor pulling the serpent from the sea. This is especially noteworthy given a similar image found in Gosforth Church in Cumberland, where a stone panel, likely once part of a cross, shows two figures in a boat with a large bait at the end of a line. Above the boat is a snake-like figure, possibly representing the world serpent. Interestingly, the poems don't make it clear whether the hammer strike ends the serpent's life. Snorri's version, drawing on Völuspá, says that Thor only manages to kill the serpent during Ragnarok, the final cosmic battle, and that he himself dies from the creature's poison immediately afterward. However, some earlier traditions may have placed this victory earlier in his life, portraying Thor as the triumphant slayer of the monster. Snorri himself seems to notice this inconsistency. After telling the fishing tale, he admits it's unclear whether the serpent survived. In Hymiskvida, the outcome is similarly left uncertain, though Thor is still called the sole slayer of the serpent. This myth of the sky god battling a world-threatening monster is not unique to Norse tradition. It fits a well-known pattern in global mythology. In India, for instance, the thunder god Indra, who shares many traits with Thor, fights and defeats a massive dragon. These stories carry a powerful idea that the sky and thunder god, a figure of immense strength, stands as mankind's protector by facing and defeating the terrible forces that threaten the world's order and survival. More will be said about this monstrous enemy in future episodes. The giants that Thor defeats in the myths are not defined by any unique traits beyond their massive size, strength, and overwhelming greed. They are particularly envious of the gods' possessions and are constantly seeking opportunities to raid Asgard and steal its treasures. Several sources suggest that Thor's battles against these enemies were continuous and numerous, with only a few stories surviving into later tradition. A 10th century poem by Thorbjorn Dísarskald, for instance, lists many obscure names of giants that Thor is said to have slain, repeating the line, "Thor has guarded Asgard with courage." Thor's role was not limited to defending the realm of the gods. He was also considered a protector of humanity, referred to as the refuge of men. His battles were seen as struggles on behalf of mankind and the fragile civilization they had carved out in a world full of danger and chaos. When viewed from this perspective, his mythic feats align well with the prose descriptions of him as a divine figure who upheld order, supported farming and settlement, safeguarded family life, and ensured safe passage for travelers. Thor did not only protect the shining halls of the gods, he also watched over the modest homes and farms of Norway and Iceland, homes made sacred through his fire and marked by the symbol of his hammer. He was the guarantor of oaths and agreements between people, investing them with the sacred authority of his temples and shrines. As a sky god, he drove his chariot across the heavens, able to bless travelers with good weather and helpful winds. In the divine realm, he shielded the goddesses who represented peace and abundance, so they could bestow their gifts upon the world. On Earth, especially in the rough northern landscapes of stone and storm, he constantly battled against the cold and violent forces that threatened human life. It is easy to see why Thor gained the loyalty of people who lived in constant struggle against harsh conditions and hostile powers. And it is no surprise that even long after Christianity had taken hold, Thor remained a central figure in the old stories that continued to be told across the North. The gods who controlled war and sent thunder from the sky were, at their core, forces of destruction. Still, they could also offer protection against chaos and lawlessness. Alongside these fearsome figures in Asgard lived other deities whose influence was of a very different kind. Their powers were tied to peace, prosperity, and the fertility of the cultivated world. These gods were known as the Vanir, and among them, the most prominent were Freyr and Freya, twin siblings, and the children of the sea god Njord. Although the myths in the Prose Edda don't offer many detailed stories about the Vanir, the writer Snorri clearly regarded them as significant and influential. He emphasized that their worship endured well into the later days of the Old Faith. Freyr, in particular, was called God of the World and was deeply cherished by the Swedish people. According to the old tales, during his time, the land experienced greater peace and richer harvests than ever before. The only surviving myth about Freyr that Snorri shares comes from an old poem. It tells of Freyr falling in love with a beautiful maiden named Gerd, who lived among the giants in the underworld. Freyr sent his servant Skirnir to woo her on his behalf. After some struggle, Gerd finally agreed to meet Freyr and become his bride. Some scholars see this story as a symbolic union between the sky god and the earth goddess, representing the coming of fruitful harvests and seasonal abundance. Other sources suggest that this idea of a divine marriage played a central role in Freyr's worship, just as it did in many fertility cults of the ancient Near East. A curious and ironic tale preserved in a medieval Icelandic saga adds a comic perspective to Freyr's cult. The story follows a young Norwegian man named Gunnar Helming, who, after falling out with King Olaf, fled to Sweden. In Sweden, Gunnar discovered that Freyr was still held in high regard. At his temple, a young woman served as the god's priestess and was known as his wife. Gunnar formed a close bond with her, and when the time came for Freyr to go on his autumn journey across the land to bless the season, Gunnar was invited to join. The priestess, however, was unsure whether the god would approve of this arrangement. During the journey, a snowstorm struck as they crossed a mountain pass. Everyone abandoned the god's wagon, except for Gunnar. Alone in the storm, he did his best to lead the wagon forward, but eventually stopped to rest. The priestess warned him that Freyr would be angry. Then, in a strange twist, Freyr is said to have stepped from his wagon and attacked Gunnar. In the heat of the struggle, Gunnar called on the Christian god of King Olaf, and with newfound strength, he defeated Freyr and destroyed his image. What followed was even more unexpected. Gunnar decided to dress in Freyr's garments and impersonate the god. The plan worked. Despite the storm, they reached the feast they had been invited to, and the people were overjoyed to see their god among them. This new Freyr ate, drank, and joined their celebrations. Even more surprisingly, instead of demanding sacrifices, he asked for clothes and valuables, something the people gladly gave. The winter turned out well, and when it was discovered that Freyr's priestess was with child, the god's fame grew even more. But this strange chapter came to a close when King Olaf heard about Gunnar's activities in Sweden. He summoned him back at once. Gunnar quietly left, taking the priestess and the wealth he had gathered, and returned to Norway. Although the tale is likely fictional, and perhaps inspired by older stories of tricksters pretending to be gods, it still gives us insight into the practices once associated with Freyr's worship in Sweden. The humor of the story depends on the belief that the statue of Freyr was taken around the land during winter festivals, that people truly believed the god was present in his image, and that his priestess communicated his wishes to the people. The people's joy at seeing their god feast with them and father a child is a satirical reflection on the kind of devotion they had. And perhaps this story also hints at why the fertility cult never became as central in the harsh northern lands as it did in the warm, fertile regions of the south. The image of Freyr, the bringer of warmth and renewal, stranded in a snowdrift on a Swedish mountain road, paints a rather sad and ironic picture. This isn't the only story that speaks of a god being carried through the land in a sacred wagon. Another tale, found in a medieval saga, tells of a Swedish king who consulted a god named Lightyear in a similar way. Although not much is known about Lightyear, his name appears in several Swedish place names, suggesting that he might have been another name or form of Freyr. According to the story, King Eric led the god's wagon to a certain place and waited for it to grow heavy, a sign that the deity had entered it. Once this happened, the wagon was brought to the king's hall, where he welcomed the god, drank in his honor, and asked him questions. This seems to have been a form of divination, where the king himself was allowed to seek the god's guidance. Long before this, another account from early northern Europe describes a goddess who traveled in a wagon to bring fertility to the land and its people. The Roman writer Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, mentions such a goddess among the Danes. Her name was Nerthus, and she was considered a powerful earth mother who could influence human affairs. She was transported in a sacred wagon, which only the priest could touch or look inside. When not in use, the wagon was kept hidden in a grove on an island. At a special moment, known only to the priest, the goddess was believed to be present. Her wagon, drawn by oxen, was then taken out to visit the people. Wherever Nerthus traveled, she was greeted with joy. People put away their weapons, and a period of peace and calm followed. When the journey was over, the wagon, the cloth that covered it, and whatever sacred object it held were all washed in a holy lake. The slaves who performed this task were drowned afterward, so that no one would reveal the mystery of what they had seen. Although a great stretch of time separates Tacitus's account from the tale of Gunnar Helming, the similarities between the rituals are striking. Archaeology helps bridge that gap. In western Denmark, 2 finely crafted wagons were found in a peat bog, dating to around the 3rd century. Alongside them was a small wooden stool, which may have served as a seat for the deity. Nearby were clay vessels and weaving tools, suggesting a link to women. These small wagons might well have been used in the kind of sacred processions that Tacitus described. Centuries later, another ceremonial wagon was discovered in a Viking ship burial at Oseberg in Norway. This 9th century find included beautifully carved wooden objects, clearly made for ritual use, and was buried with a woman of high status. Among the burial goods were tapestries showing a wagon with a man and a woman standing beside it, possibly depicting a ritual procession much like those remembered in myth. Even older symbols exist. Small figurines from the Bronze Age, showing women kneeling as if driving chariots, may represent a similar vision of the fertility goddess traveling across the land to bless it. These rituals weren't limited to Northern Europe. In the southeast, a goddess named Cybele was also carried through the countryside. She was associated with fruitfulness and renewal. A vivid and rather mocking description of her cult appears in Apuleius's Golden Ass, where priests in women's clothing followed her image, pretending to fall into ecstasy and performing outrageous acts. Cybele's worship even reached Gaul. In the 4th century, stories about Saint Martin describe statues veiled in white being carried around the fields in seasonal processions. Other accounts, like those from Gregory of Tours, mention similar customs in cities like Autumn. Some scholars have suggested that Tacitus may have based his account of Nerthus on what he knew about Cybele's rites. But when all the independent evidence is taken into account, it becomes clear that northern fertility goddesses were indeed honored through these moving processions. Practices linked to Freyr and the Vanir likely continued in Sweden until the very end of the old pagan era. The first question that comes to mind is why a fertility goddess worshipped in Denmark during the 1st century was later replaced by a male god during the Viking Age. In written sources, Freyr is described as the chief god of abundance and fertility. According to Adam of Bremen, Freyr's statue at the temple in Uppsala was phallic in shape. He was a god who brought peace and prosperity to people and was invoked in marriages. Saxo also states that Freyr was worshipped in Uppsala. According to him, a major sacrificial ceremony called Froblot was regularly held there, and human sacrifices were included among the offerings. Worship of Freyr also involved feminine movements, mime performances on stage, and ritual dramatic presentations accompanied by the sound of bells. Saxo and the heroes he described regarded these ceremonies as degrading and shameful. Even today, elements such as cross-dressing, clapping, and the use of bells are preserved in some traditional folk performances. This suggests the existence of seasonal fertility rituals in Uppsala, performed in symbolic theatrical forms in honor of Freyr. If these rituals involved a symbolic, sacred marriage, it could help explain Saxo's disgust. Human sacrifices associated with the Vanir gods are also mentioned by Saxo and other sources. In the poem Ynglingatal, some ancient Swedish kings are described as having died in strange and violent ways. It seems that the Swedes believed their kings possessed the power to bring peace and prosperity to the land, a power also attributed to Freyr. Some scholars have argued that these ancient kings were symbolically considered married to a fertility goddess, such as Freya or Nerthus, and were sacrificed when their reigns ended. If this is true, then Freyr may have gradually evolved from being the consort of a fertility goddess into an independent god. However, this remains just a theory. We have no direct accounts from reliable outside observers that confirm such a tradition of royal sacrifice. Furthermore, no archaeological evidence supporting this practice has been found in Sweden so far. Freyr is also known to be closely associated with horse cults. Sacred horses were kept in his temple at Thrandheim in Norway. It is said that when Olaf Tryggvason came to destroy this temple, he found a stallion prepared to be sacrificed to Freyr. Olaf drove this horse into the temple, thereby defying Freyr, since it was forbidden to ride a horse dedicated to the god. In Icelandic sagas, horses are also mentioned as being kept near Freyr's temples. The most well-known example is the stallion Freyfaxi, dedicated to Freyr and owned by Hrafnkel. Hrafnkel considered the horse sacred and only allowed himself to ride it. However, when a young boy rode it unknowingly, Hrafnkel killed him to stay true to his vow. This act eventually led to Hrafnkel's downfall. His enemies threw Freyfaxi off a cliff, and Hrafnkel lost his faith and abandoned Freyr. Although fictional, this story may reflect folk traditions about the Freyr cult. Another saga also mentions a horse named Freyfaxi. In this story, followers of Freyr are said to participate in horse fighting contests. This tradition may be connected to the cult of Freyr. These horse fights, which were popular in some parts of Iceland, may originally have had religious significance. Another animal associated with Freyr and his sister Freya is the wild boar. According to Snorri, Freyr owns a magical boar named Gullinbursti, whose glowing bristles shine in the dark and runs faster than horses. Freya's boar is named Hildisvín. In the poem Hyndluljóð, Freya gives someone a boar form to conceal his identity. These animal symbols show that the connection between fertility deities and animals dates back to ancient times. In early Swedish and Anglo-Saxon England, the boar figure held great importance. It was frequently used in ceremonies, on weapons, and as decorative motifs. Some helmets from the 7th century have boar head-shaped crests. On some Swedish helmet plates, warriors are depicted wearing large boar heads on their helmets. One Anglo-Saxon helmet found in a grave at Benty Grange features a small boar figure made of gold-plated bronze with eyes adorned in garnet. These figures were believed to have protective powers. In the Beowulf epic, the boar image on a helmet is said to protect the warrior. The hilt of an Anglo-Saxon sword found in eastern England also features 3 small boar figures, thought to serve a similar purpose. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote that the Aesti, a Germanic people living on the Prussian coast in the 1st century, carried boar figures as religious symbols. These figures were likely masks or helmet decorations covering the face. Plutarch also mentioned that the Cimmerians covered their faces with helmets shaped like the jaws of wild animals. On some Swedish helmet plates, a warrior is shown wearing a boar mask with visible tusks on one side of his face. All of these findings indicate that boar-themed helmets carried great meaning in early Sweden and were valued by kings. King Athils is said to have owned a helmet called Hildegolter, meaning battle boar, and wore a heavy necklace referred to as the Piglet of Sweden. He is also said to have acquired another helmet named Hildisvín from his rival King Ali, a name that matches Freya's magical boar. When we hear that Ottar the Simple, a worshipper of Freya, disguised himself as her boar, it may suggest that priests of the Vanir once wore boar masks, claiming divine inspiration and protection from the goddess. Although the Vanir were not typically gods of war, the protection they offered likely extended to times of conflict. Both Tacitus and Beowulf emphasize the boar's role as a powerful symbol of defense. This belief appears again in Cynewulf's poem Elene, where it's said that Constantine was overshadowed by the boar sign as he received the vision of Christ's symbol. This indicates that the old heathen emblem, whether on a helmet or a banner, was still seen as a source of protection, even as it was about to be replaced by a new spiritual power.
Bounty is 2 times more absorbent, so you can get more done with 1. The quicker picker-upper.
Besides the horse and the boar, another sacred symbol tied to Freyr was the ship. Freyr was said to own a magical ship called Skidbladnir, which could carry all the gods, yet could be folded up and stored in a small pouch when not in use. This mythical vessel may reflect the existence of real cult ships, used in religious processions, which were disassembled and stored afterward. There is strong evidence of such ceremonial ships being used and preserved in Scandinavian churches from the Middle Ages, well into modern times. In Denmark, some were used in field blessing rituals, suggesting that the tradition of Freyr's sacred ship may have survived in Christian practice. The ship, as a religious symbol, has deep roots in the north. Tacitus wrote about a goddess worshipped by the Suebi, whose symbol was a boat, and he likened her to Isis, suggesting her association with fertility. While we cannot be certain, some have proposed that the mysterious symbol connected to the goddess Nerthus may also have been a ship. From the Bronze Age onwards, ships played a major role in burial customs throughout Northern Europe. Freyr himself was associated with death and burial, as noted by Snorri in the Ynglinga saga. There we are told that after Freyr died, his passing was hidden from the Swedish people for 3 years. During this time, he lay in a large burial mound, which had a door and 3 openings through which gold, silver, and copper were placed as offerings. If the god's image was stored in a tomb-like shrine, this might explain the statement in Heimskringla that 2 wooden figures were removed from Freyr's burial mound. One remained in Sweden, while the other was sent to Thrandheim in Norway. The figure sent to Thrandheim reinforces the idea that Freyr's cult spread westward, from Sweden to Norway. In Norway, many farms, rocks, and fields still bear his name. Eventually, a few settlers carried his worship even farther west to Iceland. However, place name evidence suggests that his following there was relatively small, as only 3 locations are known to bear his name. Still, memories of some of his devotees survive in Icelandic sagas. Hrafnkel, who kept sacred horses for Freyr, settled in the east in the early 10th century. While his role as a priest of Freyr is debated, the saga likely reflects traditions passed down about Freyr's cult. A more well-known follower was Thord Freysgodi, the son of Ozur, who is mentioned in several sagas. His family, known as the Freysgidlingjar, were identified with Freyr's worship, although no specific stories about him have been preserved. The title Freysgodi was also carried by Thorgrim, whose death is described in Gisla Saga. Despite his name honoring Thor, his grandfather was the famous Thor worshipper Thorolf of Most. Thorgrim allied himself with Gisli's family, married one of their daughters, and seems to have turned from Thor to Freyr. He built his temple in the northwest of Iceland. Another figure connected with Freyr's cult, though not explicitly called a priest, was Ingimund, whose family story is told in Vatnsdæla saga. It's said that King Harald Fairhair gave him a token bearing Freyr's image, and that he sailed to Iceland under the god's guidance. In Vatnsdale, he built a temple where weapons were not allowed. When a Norwegian guest entered wearing a sword, Ingimund claimed he had offended the god and demanded the weapon, which later became a prized family heirloom. Another family known for their devotion to Freyr appears in Vigaglum's saga. They lived in the northern regions of Iceland and were descended from Helgi the Leine, who claimed ancestry from King Frodi. When Helgi arrived in Iceland, it is said that he threw a boar and a sow overboard to guide him to land, a sign that he revered Freyr, though he also called upon Thor and was later baptized as a Christian. Helgi's son, Ingjald, built a temple dedicated to Freyr, and the role of temple guardian eventually passed down to Ingjald's grandson, Glum, the main figure of the saga. Glum and his mother held rights to a specific field near the temple called Vitragafi, which was believed to be especially fertile and linked to the god. The name of the field has been interpreted as meaning generous giver. Despite these privileges, things did not go well for Glum. While still a young man, he turned away from Freyr and chose instead to follow the god worshipped by his mother's family. This god was likely Odin, since Glum's grandfather from Norway had given him a spear and a sword that were said to bring good fortune and were treasured family heirlooms. Glum later used that same spear to kill a relative in the sacred field after being denied his rightful share of the grain. This violent act defiled the Holy Land, and the saga suggests that Freyr was angered by the bloodshed. Glum further dishonored the god by expelling one of Freyr's devoted followers from his property, by sheltering his own son after he had been declared an outlaw, and by taking a false oath in the god's names. As a result of these repeated offenses, Glum was eventually forced to abandon his land. People believed this misfortune was caused by Freyr's wrath. In a dream, Glum saw the god seated on a chair by the sea, surrounded by a great crowd, and refusing to hear the pleas of Glum's deceased relatives on his behalf. The sagas therefore preserve a distinct memory of Freyr's fertility cult, which stands in sharp contrast to the warlike nature of Odin's following. This peaceful and nurturing aspect of Freyr closely aligns with what Tacitus described of the earlier goddess Nerthus. The prohibition of weapons in Freyr's temples, his anger when sacred ground is defiled by bloodshed, and the exclusion of outlaws from his holy places all reflect his role as a divine bringer of peace. His association with the sun, the fertile earth, marriage, and childbirth further highlights his function as a god of life and growth. Just as Nerthus was called Mother Earth and intervened directly in human affairs, Freyr too was seen as a deity who brought prosperity and inspired joy. His followers gladly shared their wealth with him, and his presence was a source of comfort and abundance. Freyr's presence in dreams, seated by the sea, echoes older images of divine processions, like the sacred wagon of Nerthus. This aspect of his worship is also reflected in the tale of Gunnar Helming and in the accounts from Thrandheim, where Freyr's followers eagerly told King Olaf Tryggvason that their god had spoken to them, predicted future events, and provided peace and abundance. Freyr's presence in dreams, seated by the sea, echoes older images of divine processions, like the sacred wagon of Nerthus. This aspect of his worship is also reflected in the tale of Gunnar Helming and in the accounts from Thrandheim, where Freyr's followers eagerly told King Olaf Tryggvason that their god had spoken to them, predicted future events, and provided peace and abundance. Although Freyr's worshippers may have been few in Western Scandinavia, their loyalty and love for their god were so strong that their devotion was remembered long after the cult had faded. Although Freyr is the primary god associated with peace and abundance, other male figures appear in Northern tradition who share similar traits and may represent variations of the same divine concept under different names. One such figure is Frodi, depicted as an ancient Danish king. Both Snorri and Saxo describe his reign as a time of extraordinary peace and prosperity. According to Snorri, Frodi ruled Denmark while Freyr reigned in Sweden, and both periods coincided with the peaceful age of the Augustines. Saxo, although less consistent in his portrayal due to multiple kings named Frodi in his accounts, also preserves the story of a calm and thriving reign. He recounts that Frodi's body was carried around in a wagon by his people after death, before being laid to rest in a burial mound. A poem allegedly inscribed on his grave speaks of the Danes' devotion, how they carried his body long after death, before finally laying him to rest beneath the sky. The similarities between this Danish Frodi and Freyr are striking. Like Freyr, Frodi was associated with prosperity, was honored through a ceremonial wagon procession, and was entombed in a mound. The Old Norse word frodi means both wise and fruitful, making it a suitable title for a fertility god. Snorri even tells us that one of Freyr's titles was in Frodi, meaning the fruitful. These parallels suggest that Frodi may have been the Danish equivalent of Freyr, fulfilling a similar religious role. Another deity-like figure, known among the Anglo-Saxons, was Ing. The Old English runic poem, preserved in a 10th century manuscript, refers to Ing as having first been seen among the East Danes before journeying east across the sea with a wagon following behind. The poem claims that the Hardings later remembered this heroic figure. The Hardings are thought to be the same as the Husdingi, the ruling family of the Vandals, who may have once worshipped Ing in southern Sweden and carried the cult to Denmark and beyond during their migrations. Ing appears to be another name or title for a deity. Royal genealogies from Bernicia in northern England include names like Ingwe and Ingibrand as ancestral figures. Freyr himself bore titles like Ingvi or Ingunar, and the royal house of Sweden was known as the Inglings. Even in Iceland, some who worshipped Freyr had names such as Ingjald and Ingimund, suggesting that Ing was another identity under which Freyr was honored across northern Europe. A related legendary figure is Scyld, introduced at the beginning of the Old English poem Beowulf. According to the tale, a ship filled with treasure arrived in Denmark, carrying a child who would become the land's king. After a long and successful reign, the king died and was sent back to the sea on a richly laden ship. The poem names this king as Sild Sefing and refers to the Danes as the Sildings. Another version of this story appears much later in the 12th century work Gesta Regum by William of Malmesbury, where the child is named Siaf and arrives with a sheaf of grain beside him. While this later version is viewed with some skepticism, the figure of Skeef appears earlier in various sources. A 10th century chronicle says that he arrived with a boat full of weapons at the island of Skani and was made king. An even older genealogy in the 9th century Anglo-Saxon chronicle includes Sif as an ancestor of King Egbert and claims that he was born in the Ark, an attempt to link native mythology with biblical tradition. These widespread references suggest that the image of a child arriving by sea to become King of Denmark was a deeply rooted and enduring.
It's certainly real. It's using an energy field, a type of anti-gravity effect.
I think I have a responsibility to investigate it.
Somebody was threatening me and said, if you don't deliver the sphere, such and such is going to happen to you.
Two men dressed as policemen tried to take the sphere and suggested that someone, somewhere, was already trying to take control of it.
There have been spheres found before in the United States. Special forces thugs go in and get them, and people have been killed possessing them. A Green Beret who was shown several extraterrestrial devices, one of which was a sphere.
The object above the podium was a metallic sphere. The next section over, I could see symbols start to appear above where that LCD screen was.
Symbols?
The hieroglyphic lettering, but the strange thing about the letters were they were
Apparently, you can earn cash back when you dine with OnePay, so I decided to test it out at one of the most beautiful buffets in the world. This spot is in Las Vegas, and they have rows of seafood stacked high, carving stations, and tons of food options. It felt like the perfect place to try it out. First, you're going to open a OnePay cash account and make sure you meet the eligible deposit requirement. Then you're going to choose dining as your monthly cashback category, and you can earn 3% cash back on up to $150 spent on dining each month. So now you can stack plates of food, but also earn something back. Limited seafood plus rewards feels very Vegas. So let me know, how many plates do you usually eat at a buffet?
part of Anglo-Saxon tradition. William of Malmesbury's note that Sif came with a sheaf of grain suggests a connection with folk belief. In a 13th century chronicle from Abingdon, a ritual is described in which monks floated a sheaf of grain and a burning candle down the river on a shield to determine property boundaries. Since this passage was first examined by H.M. Chadwick, there has been considerable debate about whether such a practice ever truly existed, and whether it relates meaningfully to the legends of Scyld and Sheaf. While the matter remains unresolved, the recurrence of a child, a sheaf of grain, and a magically moving vessel in tradition is intriguing and suggestive of an enduring symbolic pattern. Among the gods of Asgard, another mysterious figure is Ul, whose symbol was a shield. In poetic metaphors, a shield is even called Ul's ship, suggesting that Ul may have used the shield as a kind of boat. Though Snorri says little about him, Ul was likely once a significant deity. In both Norway and Sweden, place names bearing the forms Uller and Ullin indicate his past importance. These places often appear near locations named after Freyr, Freya, Njord, and Skadi, implying some connection with the Vanir. Though his worship is scarcely attested in Denmark, a 3rd century sword scabbard found in a bog bears a runic inscription meaning servant of Ul, suggesting that his cult did exist there. Ul's name is linguistically related to words meaning glory or majesty, prompting theories that he was an early Germanic sky god. However, Snorri associates him with archery and snowshoes, while Saxo says he crossed the sea on a magical bone, perhaps skates. These attributes suggest that Ul was linked to winter landscapes and the rugged northern wilderness. He remains an enigmatic and half-forgotten figure, a reminder of the many northern gods and cults that had faded into obscurity by the time Snorri composed his myths. Among the gods of the Norse pantheon, one of the more prominent male figures associated with fertility is Njord, the father of Freyr and Freya. While his connection to abundance is likely, Njord is more commonly remembered as a sea god, especially associated with ships and coastal life. Still, it is important to recognize that his name is the masculine counterpart of the goddess Nerthus, who was described by the Roman historian Tacitus. Scholars have long debated their relationship. Perhaps in earlier times, there was a divine male-female pair, Njord and Nerthus, before Freyr took over the role once held by his father. There are other similar divine pairings whose meanings have faded, such as Uller and Ullin, or Fjorgyn and Fjorgyn. Some have speculated that Nerthus may have been reimagined as a male deity, or that Njord's wife, Skadi, who, like Ull, is linked with the mountains, bows, and snowshoes, might have originally been the male partner in the pair. But no definitive explanation exists for why this gender shift occurred in the myths. Snorri Sturluson recounts a curious story about Njord's marriage to Skadi. The two could not agree on where to live. Skadi preferred the highlands, while Njord belonged to the sea. As a result, they both were deeply unhappy when trying to live in each other's realm. One interpretation of this tale suggests it preserves a memory of an ancient 9-day festival that symbolically united a winter deity of the mountains with a warm, fertile god of the coastal lowlands. Whether this explanation holds or not, the myth paints a picture of an uneasy and sorrowful union. Looking at all these figures, it becomes clear how difficult it is to simplify the mythology of the Vanir gods. We are left with scattered remnants, fragments of long-forgotten beliefs that have been woven into the literature. Although Freyr stands out as the dominant fertility god by the end of the pagan period in Sweden, the stories are filled with echoes of older gods who may have once held similar roles. Whether these are regional versions of Freyr or faded memories of once venerated deities, we cannot say for sure. What we can observe, however, is a pattern in these traditions. Many of these male deities are described as divine ancestors or founding kings. Figures like Freyr, Frodi, Sild, and Sif are said to bring peace and prosperity to the land. There is also a recurring image of a divine child arriving across the sea to rule and restore harmony. Even Freyr is said in one poem to have received the land of Alfheim as a gift for teething, suggesting a link to early childhood. The sea plays a powerful role in these myths. These gods often arrive by ship and sometimes return to the sea when their role is complete. Freyr, Njord, Ing, Shaf, and others are all tied to water. Some of them marry giant women, like Freyr with Gerd and Njord with Skadi, forming unions that echo the contrast between nature's harshness and its abundance. They are also linked with death and burial rites. After their passing, their bodies might be carried across the land or sea before being laid in a mound or cast into the water, suggesting a divine journey beyond the human world. This association between fertility gods and death introduces another layer to their significance. In the ancient religions of the Near East and Mediterranean, gods like Osiris, Tammuz, and Adonis symbolized the life-death-rebirth cycle of the earth. Their deaths represented the coming of winter, and their return brought the joy of spring. The anthropologist James Fraser famously included the Norse god Balder in this category. Gods who die for the renewal of the world. Balder, though not one of the Vanir, is remembered for his beauty, his tragic death, and the deep sorrow it caused. In one of the Edda poems, Balder is portrayed almost like a Christ-like figure, destined to return and bring peace to a renewed world. There are also traces in northern folklore of gods whose bodies are broken and reassembled, mirroring stories from the East. One such tale comes from Finnish mythology. The Kalevala tells of Lemminkainen, who was dismembered and thrown into a river, only to be revived by his mother, who gathered his scattered remains. On a more folkloric level, the English legend of John Barleycorn represents the seasonal sacrifice of barley in the brewing of ale, his suffering told through traditional songs. In Norse myth, there is a minor figure called Bigvir, whose name means barley. He appears in the poem Lokasenna, where Loki mocks him for whispering constantly to Freyr. Bigvir's partner is Bela, whose name may mean bee, a nod to mead, the drink made from honey. In early Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies, a figure named Biau or Bio appears, possibly connected to the barley grain. But we lack solid evidence that he, or others like him, were ever worshipped as fertility gods, or that they were part of a ritual cycle of death and resurrection tied to the harvest. Returning to Balder, he is best known through Snorri's account, where all creation weeps at his death. Even during the Viking Age, some saw Balder as a parallel to Christ. In the Old English poem, The Dream of the Rood, a similar scene is imagined, nature grieving for the crucified Christ. Yet unlike the dying gods of the Mediterranean, Balder is not resurrected in the myth. His death does not bring famine, nor does his return usher in a new harvest. He remains more a tragic symbol than a savior of the land. And yet, something about his story lingers with the power of older fertility myths. Snorri's version of Balder's death, so rich in sorrow and reverence, may reflect a distant echo of the belief in a god whose death brings life to the world. Even if Balder was not one of the Vanir, The myth may have drawn from the same emotional well. In the end, the death of the fertility god touches something deep within us, a sorrow for the passing seasons and a recognition of the human condition, that we too are bound to the cycles of growth, loss, and renewal. The death of the god is only one part of the story. With the arrival of spring comes new life, renewed hope, and the promise of abundance. Harvest time brings the final fulfillment, so the mourning must eventually give way to joy. In some ancient religions, this cycle of rebirth was closely tied to a belief in personal immortality for human beings. But in the northern traditions of Europe, this belief doesn't appear to have taken root. We hear of Freyr lying in his burial mound and Frodi resting in his sacred wagon. The early Swedish kings were often sent to the afterlife in strange, sometimes violent ways. One tale even describes the body of Halfdan the Black, an early king of Norway, being divided among his people, each of 4 districts receiving a part of his dismembered remains. Yet, for all this, there is no clear tradition of resurrection like that found in the myth of Osiris. Although Freyr was believed to return each year with his priestess and sacred wagon, and Nerthus was similarly received with joy by the Danes in earlier times, there is no strong suggestion that this return came from the realm of the dead. In the same way, Baldur's story includes no triumphant return, despite Hel's promise that universal mourning might bring him back. What we see instead in many of these myths is a pattern of succession. A younger, more vigorous deity steps in to take the place of the one who has passed. Sometimes a divine child rules for a time before departing and leaving his role to another. The fragments of the old northern fertility religion that survive in literature seem to emphasize this cycle of replacement rather than resurrection. It's possible that we're being misled by incomplete or distorted accounts, but overall, this idea remains consistent across many stories. In this ancient belief system, the male fertility god is destined to die for the sake of the land and for the people. Meanwhile, the goddess does not die. Her role is to grieve for the fallen god, perhaps to aid in his return, or to give birth to a child who will carry on his legacy. The world mourns with her, but then also rejoices in the renewed cycle of life. This pattern helps us understand the role played by Frigg, who begged all things to weep for her son Baldur. Later, it is the sons of the gods who avenge their fathers and rule over a renewed Asgard after the first.
Sleeping, binging shows. You'd never guess that I was actually in the middle of my 30-day challenge. Actually do what you love, but do it on the bike. Watch your shows, take calls, even nap. But keep moving. And without even trying to get skinny. I accidentally got strong. Now, I don't just move that I look forward to it.
Do parents cover kids' eyes to protect them?
Uh-oh, that's a scary part.
Or to secretly steal their Reese's?
It doesn't sound scary.
Super scary.
Perhaps moms know everything happens for a Reese's.
Has been destroyed. Yet even in Baldur's tale, the full pattern doesn't quite fit. Freyr, for example, leaves behind no avenging son. His line, like that of Frodi and Sill, continues through the mortal kings of the land, each of whom eventually joins the dead, perhaps through sacrifice. To complete the picture of fertility in Norse myth, we must turn to the goddesses. In many early religions, the Earth Mother is paired with the Sky Father. The earth is made fertile by the heavens, and the image of the nurturing Earth Mother, from whom we are born, who feeds us, and to whom we return, is a deeply rooted one. The Roman historian Tacitus spoke of Nerthus, the goddess worshipped by the Danes, as Mother Earth. But whether her worshippers saw her as consort to the sky, god Tiwaz, is still uncertain. Finding clear evidence for Earth Mother worship in pre-Christian Scandinavia is challenging. Thor's mother, Fjorgyn, is mostly a name, though poets often use it as a word for earth. There is a male version of the name too, Fjorgyn, which may point to another divine pair of fertility gods now lost to time. In Snorri's Asgard, the only remaining maternal figure is Frigg, wife of Odin and mother of Balder. Some myths accuse her of being unfaithful, but her main role is that of the revered wife and mother, queen of heaven and consort to the high god. In her earlier Germanic form, Freya, she gives her name to Friday, the day associated with Venus throughout the Germanic world. A rare surviving myth about Freya comes from the 8th century historian Paul the Deacon in his tale of the origins of the Lombards. In that story, Freya helped her people gain a new name and win a battle. She instructed the Winili tribe to bring their women before Woden at sunrise, their long hair covering their faces. Then she turned Woden's bed to face east, so when he awoke, he saw the tribe and asked, "Who are these Longbeards?" By naming them, he was bound to give them victory. The story suggests that Frigga had power not only over fate, but also over naming, something we see in other stories as well. Another tale shows Frigg and Odin supporting rival brothers, Geirrod and Agnar. Frigg tricks Geirrod into mistreating Odin in disguise, and as a result, Geirrod perishes and Agnar takes the throne. In the Edda poem Oddrunargratr, Frigg is invoked by women in childbirth alongside Freya. She is also mentioned in the opening of the Volsunga saga, where a king and queen pray for a child. And Frigg is the one who hears them and asks Odin to grant their wish. Her strong association with the family and fertility made Friday a fortunate day for weddings in German traditions for many centuries. There seems to have been a connection between Frigg and the mysterious supernatural women believed to influence a child's destiny at birth. These figures were widely remembered in northwestern Europe. Even in the 11th century, Bishop Burchard of Worms found it necessary to criticize women for leaving food out for the so-called parquet, 3 mystical women thought to shape the future of newborns. It was common, he noted, to set 3 places at the table for them. In Norse mythology, we encounter similar figures, the Norns. One story, told by Saxo, speaks of a Danish king named Fridlif, who brought his young son Olaf to the house of the gods, where 3 maidens sat on 3 seats. The first gave the boy charm, the second generosity, but the third cursed him to be stingy with his gifts. Evidence of these powerful female beings exists from Roman times as well. Inscriptions and carvings found across Germany, Holland, and Britain show groups of women known as the Mothers. Sometimes depicted alone, but more often in pairs or trios, they are shown seated or standing, their long hair flowing, often holding fruit or horns of plenty. Occasionally, they appear with cloaked and hooded figures, known as the Geni Cucullati, the hooded ones. These stones date back to the 1st century and are especially numerous in the Rhineland, but some have been discovered as far north as Hadrian's Wall in Britain. The names inscribed emphasize their abundance and generosity. Names like Gabii and Alagabii suggest divine giving. These female deities were venerated by both Celtic and Germanic peoples, and they were clearly linked with fertility, domestic well-being, and the protection of home and family. In Anglo-Saxon England, they left a trace in the name Modronite, the Night of the Mothers. which, as Bede tells us, was once a pagan celebration held on the eve of what later became Christmas. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence about the worship of a fertility goddess comes from the figure of Nerthus. According to Tacitus, she was worshipped on an island sanctuary. That island might well have been Zealand, the land where Copenhagen stands today. The region was historically tied to Lair, the seat of the Danish kings, and even the old place name Nyartharum, now Nærum, may preserve her memory. In Norse legend, Zealand is said to have been formed by the goddess Gefjon. According to Snorri, she plowed out a piece of Sweden to form the island. Gefjon had a sanctuary at Lair and was said to have married Skjold, one of the legendary sea kings who brought peace and prosperity to Denmark. Like Freya, one of whose names was Geffen, Gefjon seems connected with agriculture, femininity, and the underworld. Her name even resembles those of the Roman mothers, suggesting a shared or overlapping role as divine givers. Gefjon's myth includes a story of a magical necklace gifted to her by a beautiful youth in exchange for her love. She also had a connection to the dead, with Snorri stating that unmarried women went to her after death. These associations, fertility, the plow, gifts, and the afterlife, paint the picture of a complex goddess who gave freely and represented both life and death. Remnants of a goddess with ties to the earth and fertility persisted in Anglo-Saxon England. One of the clearest examples is an old charm intended to bless the land. Though it had undergone Christian influence by the time it was recorded, its roots lie in older beliefs. The chant begins with a prayer facing east, appealing to the Lord, to the heavens, and to the earth. Then, ritual items like incense, fennel, soap, and salt were to be rubbed onto the wooden plow, along with seeds taken from a beggar. The invocation calls out, "Urs, Urs, Urs, Earth Mother, may the Almighty Eternal Lord grant you fields to increase and flourish, fields fruitful and healthy, shining harvest of shafts of millet, broad harvests of barley. Hail to thee, Earth, Mother of men. Bring forth now in God's embrace, filled with good for the use of men." This poetic imagery of heaven and earth united echoes older religious ideas, perhaps long forgotten, yet still alive in tradition. The word Urche has been interpreted by some as the name of a lost earth goddess, though it might also be a powerful cry of invocation. While no exact parallel to the rites of Nerthus or Friar survives from pagan England, echoes of those ancient beliefs remained. Even the name Gefjon may have lived on in the Old English word geophon, a poetic term for the sea. Though the concept of a mother goddess remains elusive and shadowy in northern myth, it cannot be dismissed. Frigg, often misunderstood or overlooked, plays a significant role. As the Queen of Asgard and Odin's wife, she is a consistent figure in the myths, even if the stories about her are few and lacking in detail. The absence of place names tied to her might simply mean she was remembered under different names. In Snorri's writings, she is often eclipsed by the more dramatic figure of Freya. Now it becomes important to understand why Freya rose to such prominence in the mythology of the North. When Snorri introduced Freya into his account of the Norse gods, he described her as the most famous among the goddesses, and noted that she alone among the gods was still believed to live. This statement suggests that Snorri was aware her worship had survived, in parts of Scandinavia, into his own time. Fertility cults, especially in rural and isolated areas, are known to endure long after official belief systems change. Indeed, the number of places named after Freya in southern Sweden and southwestern Norway supports the idea that she remained a powerful and beloved figure in folk memory. She was no invention of poets. She was real to those who worshipped her. Freya was known as the goddess or bride of the Vanir. One scandalous tale told by Loki accused her of having romantic relations with her brother, Freyr. Snorri gave a more culturally contextual explanation, saying that sibling marriages were common among the Vanir, and that both Freya and Freyr were the children of Njord and his sister. Freya was closely associated with romantic relationships and was often invoked for help in matters of love. Yet she was also the target of ridicule. Loki accused her of taking all the gods and elves as lovers, while the giantess Hyndla mocked her as a wandering she-goat in heat. Christian poets later echoed this scorn, pairing her name with Odin and insulting her character. Despite these accusations, there are surprisingly few actual stories of scandalous behavior, apart from a late tale where she supposedly earned her famous necklace by sleeping with the 4 dwarves who made it. She was also frequently the object of desire for giants, although she never seemed to return their affections. The humorous tone in the poem Thrimskvida, which portrays Freya as overly eager for a wedding night, hints that ritual marriage may have played a part in her cult practices. But Freya's influence wasn't limited to earthly love. She had deep connections to death and the afterlife. In Egil's saga, a young woman named Thorgerda, grieving her brother's death, threatened to starve herself until she could dine with Freya. In Grimnismal, it's said that Freya receives half of the warriors slain in battle each day, while the other half go to Odin. Like Frigg, Freya was described as a goddess who weeps. Her golden tears became a poetic image beloved by early Norse poets. The reason for her sorrow isn't entirely clear. Snorri mentions she weeps for her lost husband, Odd, but tells us little more. This tale may be a fading memory of a fertility goddess mourning a dead or missing divine lover, a common motif in ancient religion. Snorri also tells us that Freya had many names. Geffen, meaning giver, connects her to the Danish goddess Gefjon. Another name, Mardol, may hint at ties to the sea. Syr, meaning sow, shows that the boar, a powerful fertility symbol, belonged to her as much as to Freyr. In East Sweden, her name appears in place names linked to the cultivation of flax, suggesting regional variations of her worship. Another possible name, Skialf, was used for an ancient Swedish queen who wore a boar-shaped helmet and is believed to have worshipped the Vanir. In one story, Skialf kills her husband using a necklace, hinting at the symbolic and possibly sacrificial power of such items in early Norse society. The necklace most closely tied to Freya is the Brisingamen. Though some have suggested it might have been a girdle or a piece of amber, the word generally refers to a necklace worn at the neck. Its role in the myths suggests it was one of her most treasured possessions. Interestingly, a similarly named item, the Brosingamene, appears in the Old English poem Beowulf, though its origin and meaning remain mysterious. It may have referred to its brightness, or to a clan known as the Brisings. Whatever its
One sheet of Bounty versus one sheet of the competitive brand. Bounty's durable diamond texture is thicker and holds up better to your toughest messes, even when wet. Get more done with one. Bounty, the quicker picker-upper.
Protecting what you care about is important to you, so it's important to Allstate. That's why we have a plan to protect just about anything, like this car and this awesome bike. This golf cart, it's protected. If it's important to you, it's important to us. You're in good hands with Allstate.
origin, the image of a woman wearing a powerful symbolic necklace has ancient roots. Similar figurines have been found in Bronze Age Denmark and the Mediterranean, all seemingly linked to fertility cults. Freya also possessed a magical feathered cloak or falcon shape, allowing her to fly over great distances. This power is mentioned several times in Norse myths and was shared by gods like Odin and Loki. While later sources describe it as a costume borrowed by Loki, the original belief likely held that Freya herself transformed into a bird, a divine shapeshifter who could soar across the worlds. Snorri specifically associates Freya with a powerful form of magic called Sidur. He claims she was a priestess of the Vanir who taught this form of sorcery to the Aesir. We know from various sources that Sidur involved building a raised platform, singing ritual chants, and entering an ecstatic trance. The person who performed it, usually a woman, was called a völva. She would often be accompanied by a chorus who sang or provided musical support. In the trance, she would deliver prophetic answers to those who sought her insight. Most of the time, her visions focused on the fertility of the land, the future of young people, or upcoming seasons. While Sidur could sometimes refer to harmful magic used against enemies, most accounts portray it as a tool for divination and spiritual guidance. The völva, a respected seeress, was someone who held great power and was often invited to feasts or gatherings. One of the most detailed accounts of such a visit comes from Eric the Red's saga, set in the Greenland colony. Though some doubt whether such practices continued in Greenland at that time, the description of the völva's tools, clothing, and behavior closely resembles the shamans of northeastern Europe and Asia. These striking similarities not only help us understand how the ceremony worked, but also lend credibility to the saga accounts as reflections of genuine tradition. In the ancient traditions of Northern Europe and Asia, shamanism was a deeply spiritual practice carried out by highly trained men and women. These shamans acted as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Their spirits were believed to leave their bodies during trances and journey through the realms of the dead or the heavens. Sometimes, these journeys were described aloud in chants. The shaman could reach this altered state through rhythmic drumming or intense, ritualistic dance. Every aspect of the ceremony, his movements, his costume, held symbolic meaning. The clothing worn by shamans often included animal skins, feathers, and metallic shapes resembling birds or beasts. Some even dressed as specific animals like bears or birds. While in trance, the shaman would communicate with spirit animals, imitating their calls to gain favor or insight. He might symbolically climb a ladder or tree to represent his ascent into the sky, or imagine himself flying upon a bird to reach otherworldly realms. The purpose of these ceremonies was typically to uncover hidden truths, why famine struck, what caused illness, or what the future held for individuals or the community. In healing rituals, the shaman's spirit would seek out the soul of the sick and fight off the spirits holding it captive. This echoes the saga of the völva, a female seeress described in Eric the Red's saga, who wore boots of calfskin, gloves made of catskin, and sat high on a platform atop a cushion filled with feathers. A meal was prepared from the hearts of all available animals, offered to empower her. During the ceremony, she called for someone to sing the magical chant. A young Christian woman, reluctant at first, agreed to sing a childhood spell. The völva later praised her, saying the chant had summoned many spirits who revealed hidden knowledge. She then addressed the pressing question of whether the ongoing famine would end, foretold the singer's marriage prospects, and answered many personal queries from those who gathered. Accounts like this appear across the sagas and share strong similarities with modern observations of shamanic rituals in northern Eurasia. While Norse stories don't always mention the spirit's journey directly, they often hint at it in symbolic and poetic ways. Poems like Voluspa, or Prophecy of the Seeress, present first-hand visions from a wise woman who unveils secrets unknown to humankind. Others describe terrifying journeys through ice, fire, and darkness, aligning closely with the spiritual battles and hardships faced by shamans on their visionary quests. This connection becomes even more meaningful when we look at Freya's role in Norse mythology. She was said to be a master of satyr, the very type of magic practiced in these ceremonies, and was credited with teaching it to the gods. Like the shamans, she could take the form of a bird, allowing her to traverse vast distances. As a goddess of fertility, love, and prosperity, she had dominion over the same aspects of life that the vulva addressed: seasons, abundance, marriage, and the fate of children. Seeresses were known to travel from farm to farm, much like Freya's brother Freyr, predicting the weather and the outcome of the harvest. One vulva in particular was said to fill a bay with fish using her magic, demonstrating their role in ensuring abundance and good fortune. These wise women also played a part in shaping destiny. In the tale of Norna Gest, groups of spae wives were invited into homes to foretell the future of newborns. Guests would offer gifts and food to these women in return for their blessings. In one story, a vulva became angry after being jostled from her seat during a prophecy session, revealing how formal and revered these rituals were. This reverence for female seers aligns with much older traditions of goddess worship, echoing the ancient belief in the mothers who watched over families and shaped children's futures. The vulva described in Greenland was said to be the last of a group of 9 women. Elsewhere, sagas describe seeresses traveling together, suggesting that these ceremonies may have originally been performed by groups rather than lone figures. Over time, the tradition may have declined, and individual women carried on the rituals in isolation as the old ways weakened. One fascinating detail is the use of animal fur in the vulva's costume. Snorri Sturluson mentions that Freya rode in a chariot pulled by cats, a strange but symbolic image. The soft, white catskin gloves worn by the vulva might represent a deeper link between the goddess and her animal spirits, which guided the seeress on her spiritual journeys. In another saga, a vulva gives a prophecy in the name of Freyr, telling a young man that it is Freyr's will for him to settle in Iceland. This indicates that the Vanir gods, like Freya and Freyr, were still spiritually present in the practices of these wise women. While cider was often seen as the domain of women, there are stories of men practicing it as well. However, male practitioners were frequently met with suspicion or hostility. One of King Harald Fairhair's sons, Ragnvald, was known to practice cider with 80 companions and was ultimately killed by his own family. His descendant, Eyvind, suffered a similar fate. Both were condemned in the chronicles for engaging in what was considered unnatural or dangerous magic. These examples suggest that in older times, the spiritual practices of satyr were not strictly gendered, but later generations may have viewed them as shameful for men, possibly because of their associations with ecstatic trance and submission to mystical forces. Interestingly, the link between women and prophecy wasn't unique to the Norse. Roman historian Tacitus writes of a Germanic seeress named Veleda, who lived in a tower and offered prophetic messages through an intermediary. The Germans, he notes, believed that women possessed divine insight, and some were even worshipped as goddesses. Through this lens, the wandering vulva becomes more than a figure of folklore. She may have been the final incarnation of a fertility goddess whose blessings touched every part of life, from planting seeds in the earth to welcoming newborns into the world. These ceremonies created a sacred space where women played a central role, not only as participants, but as spiritual leaders. Freya and Frigg both seem to have been deeply connected to these rituals, offering protection and guidance during childbirth, marriage, and the shaping of young lives. In their stories, we find echoes of ancient rites that honored the divine feminine and recognized the power of women to shape fate itself. While Seder was often seen as a mystical practice of healing and prophecy, there was undoubtedly a darker side to it. In some accounts, it involved harmful magic that could even bring death. These sinister aspects sometimes appear alongside the horse cult, which itself was linked to the gods of the Vanir. One story tells of an early Swedish king who was trampled to death by a sorceress who had transformed into a horse. In Iceland, a woman was once accused of using magic to ride a man to death, an act portrayed in more detail in the saga of Eyrbyggja, where the witch is depicted as terrifying and malevolent. Echoes of this belief persisted for centuries. A 12th century English chronicle accused the wife of King Edgar of being a witch, claiming she took the form of a horse and galloped shamelessly with stallions in the night. While this may have been slander, the form of the accusation is telling. It mirrors old tales of Freya herself, who was said to roam at night like a she-goat among the bucks, suggesting lingering fears about dangerous transformative women tied to ancient fertility cults. Such stories may also help explain the strong taboo against eating horse meat that has survived in some regions. Across Scandinavia, the goddess of the Vanir seems to have appeared under different names. In the north, legends tell of Thorgerda Holgabrúthr, worshipped with great fervor by Jarl Hakon of Hålogaland and regarded as his divine wife. Her image stood in temples, and her role appears tied to the Vanir gods. One saga recounts how King Olaf dragged her statue through the dirt behind a horse, mocking and humiliating her. Saxo describes her as one of Freyr's kin, eventually cast into a brothel with her companions. Later sagas link her with trolls and monstrous beings. To the Christian storytellers of the Middle Ages, her cult radiated something eerie and threatening. Interestingly, Frigg, the queen of the Aesir, is largely untouched by such dark portrayals. And yet there's little doubt that Frigg and Freya share a deep connection. Frigg, often seen as a sorrowful mother and a goddess of childbirth, seems to emerge from the same traditions that gave rise to Freya and the Vanir cult. These two figures may represent two faces of the same.
The Jimenez family are having battery issues, but an AutoZoner helps them find the right Duralast battery.
Celebrate free at AutoZone. Free products with exclusive deals now through July 27th.
Get in the zone, AutoZone.
Gird your loins.
You got it, dude.
Set your mind to rewind with throwbacks from Disney Plus and Hulu.
Oh, snap, sweet niblets.
Celebrate the good times.
Picture this. Sicily. Sing to me, Paolo.
Remember the best lines.
You nasty.
Ancient goddess, an idea not unfamiliar to other mythologies. In the ancient world, goddesses often appeared in pairs or triads. In the Near East, there were Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. In Greece, Hera, Aphrodite, and Artemis. Each trio embodied different aspects of femininity: wife and mother, passionate lover, and pure virgin. In the Norse world, Frigg and Freya could represent the first two, while the third, perhaps the independent and wild huntress Skadi, might have once completed the trio. Even within the late sources that remain, we can glimpse two very different sides to the worship of the Vanir goddess. One side was deeply rooted in family, marriage, and fertility. It was respectable and enduring. The visits of seeresses to farms and villages, where they offered blessings and foresight, are likely the last echoes of this tradition. These practices were welcomed, remembered, and recorded without shame. But alongside these honorable customs, there existed a more troubling side. Some rituals described by Christian writers like Saxo Brim with horror and condemnation. These stories speak of rites so disturbing that even in a world of warriors and bloodshed, they were singled out for special scorn. And yet, the repulsion may not have been purely a product of Christian values. Fertility goddesses throughout history, from Cybele to Isis, have often carried this same duality. They could bless with life or curse with destruction. They were healers and lovers, but also figures of wild power that defied social norms. This dual nature helps us understand Frigg and Freya more clearly. In Asgard, they are remembered as goddesses of beauty, motherhood, and desire. But behind their names lies an ancient legacy, one filled with awe, fear, mystery, and the untamed power of the divine feminine. The Vanir gods of Norse mythology remain some of the most elusive and complex figures in the ancient northern traditions. Their names and stories often blur, tangled in layers of myth and local legend. Yet despite this complexity, a recognizable pattern emerges. The Vanir resemble fertility deities found in many parts of the world, gods and goddesses who bring growth, abundance, and the continuation of life. In figures like Freyr and Freya, we see familiar motifs of renewal, fecundity, and seasonal cycles that echo across cultures. According to the medieval writer Snorri Sturluson, the Vanir were once a rival tribe of gods who fought the Aesir before eventually forging peace. Yet aside from Njord and Freyr, few Vanir names are preserved in the surviving myths. It's likely that the Vanir once included a vast collection of local fertility deities, gods of specific regions, villages, and families, whose identities have now faded. Names like Ing, Scyld, and Frodi hint at a much broader pantheon that once existed. Freyr himself, revered as the god of prosperity and growth, seems to have embodied a title more than a personal name. Just as Freya means simply lady, Freyr means lord. In festivals like May Day, echoes of these ancient fertility figures may still linger. Frodi, whose name means fruitful, appears in several legends as a wise and prosperous king. But like Freyr, he too may have been more of a symbolic figure than a historical one. Across the northern world, fertility gods were likely represented by priest kings, living men who embodied the god for a time and served as vessels of his divine power. Though some temples held statues and relics of the Vanir,
All right, y'all, man. We've been watching that for a minute. So I'm gonna pause that, man, and next Sunday we can continue and get into it. We've been live for about 4 hours, man. So I'm gonna shut that down. Appreciate everybody for pulling up. So like I say, man, we continue to do a part 2 of it. And you know what I'm saying, we can get into it. But man, listen, don't forget, man. Questions, pen, paper, write shit down. Let us. And man, yeah, but so that's a bit of Norse mythology and shit like that. I really don't want to speak on it and get into it. Because I thought we was gonna have people. You know what I'm saying, and I know sometimes y'all listening to a lot of disinformation and just watching a lot of disinformation, they be like, you feel me, versus talking about it. But I like doing this because, you know, like again, you know, because if you're not familiar with it or you think you're familiar with it, we get into these things, and then you say, "Oh, okay, yeah, I was right about this, that, and the third." And like I said, you write your questions down, and then we able to come back to it and answer or get into, what I'm saying, certain topics of discussion about, what I'm saying, Norse mythology, Zeus, Odin, Loki, all that good stuff. So, yeah, man, I enjoyed my time with y'all, man. Like I said, it's been 4 hours, man. Shout out to everybody. Shout out to everybody that was in the chat that came through. Hurricane, Two Wheels, GG, Bobby T, Fambow, else. But yeah, man, you hear me? Shit. Like I said, it was an informative video. It was a few things that I could have stopped it. It could have been like da 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 da. But for the most part, I mean, a lot of the information was, what I'm saying, right and exact. I'm saying, to most of my understanding. Because I really can't say it was quackery because, like, again, the claim of it is mythology. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like a real so-called practice religion of modern times, but it was practiced then. And like I say, in some small circles, it still is practiced. Stop pushing. It's not real popular, Yeah. Here today. So, yeah, man, appreciate everybody for pulling up. So yeah, man, keep everybody your thoughts, prayers, views, meditations. Don't forget to master these 5 key components of life. That's love, peace, respect, motivation, and inspiration, man. And guess I'm gonna get on up out of here, y'all. Peace until next Sunday. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow, man, for Manly Mandate, man. We'll be in the building. Hopefully we have some fun and chop it up a little more. Peace.